Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
If you'll be so kind as to let me read some opening remarks and lay out some of the housekeeping, and then we can hear your testimony.
Thank you.
So good morning. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. I want to introduce the other commissioners who are here. To my right is Vice Chair Sean Varner, Commissioner Jana Sidley, who is the subcommittee chair for this particular study, Commissioner Emerson. We expect that Commissioner Aroner will arrive in a little bit, and I understand Senator Jim Nielsen is in a budget hearing, and so he'll be here as soon as he can get away.
So will David. He's on his way. David.
All right. Commissioner David Byer will be sitting to my left, and then we expect Commissioner Chad Mays. And we have Commissioner Kathy Schwamberger. So welcome to all my fellow commissioners. Also today are the commission staff. To my immediate left is Executive Director Ethan Rarick, and at my far right is Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster. In the audience is the study's project manager, Crystal Beckham. If you would raise your hand, thank you. And analyst Rachel Mattioli, thank you, and Sherry McAllister. Sherry McAllister makes sure that the trains run on time. Let me talk about some housekeeping. We're going to break around noon for lunch, and then we'll reconvene in this room at 1:30. We're going to have a business meeting during lunch in room 125 on the first floor. The public is welcome to join us. We are live streaming the hearing today via Assembly TV. After the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the video recording on our website. If you'd like to make a public comment, please give a public comment slip to either Rachel or Crystal. Those can be found at the front desk. Public comments will be taken at the end of the hearing and will be limited to 3 minutes. It is appropriate that we are holding this hearing in February, which is Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. The Centers for Disease Control reports that nearly 1 in 11 high school girls and 1 in 15 high school boys have experienced physical dating violence during the past year. Rates of violence are higher for young people whose gender identity and sexual orientation do not match mainstream norms. Teen dating violence often leads to additional intimate partner violence later in life and has many long-term consequences. Studies have found that young people who experience dating violence are more likely to engage in unhealthy relationships as adults, to struggle with substance abuse disorders, and even to have suicidal thoughts. This hearing does not specifically focus on teen dating violence, but the Commission affirms President Obama's declaration when he created Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. We all share responsibility for making dating violence an act that is never tolerated in our communities or among those we know. The Commission held its first hearing on this topic in October. We heard from researchers, service providers, advocates, and others dedicated to helping families affected by intimate partner violence. Last month, we held an advisory committee that brought together stakeholders, and commissioners had the opportunity to visit My Sister's Cafe, a service provider here in Sacramento committed to helping survivors support themselves financially. We will continue the conversation about economic security today. But first, we will hear from representatives within state government about how they serve those affected by intimate partner violence and how the state is working to prevent Californians from experiencing such violence in the first place. We are honored to have Senator Susan Rubio with us to open today's hearing. She represents California's 22nd Senate District in eastern Los Angeles County. She has long been a leader on this issue and a staunch advocate for families affected by domestic and intimate partner violence, and was also recently profiled in the Los Angeles Times. Quite a remarkable story and quite a wonderful history of your family.
Thank you.
Prior to her career in government, Senator Rubio served as a teacher for nearly 2 decades in Los Angeles County. She was elected as city clerk of Baldwin Park in 2005 and to the Baldwin Park City Council in 2009. She was elected in 2018 to the Senate, where she quickly established herself as a leader on domestic violence and many other issues. She's here today to talk about her legislative work on intimate partner violence, and we are very, very grateful for your participation. Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Chairman and members. Thank you for having me here. It's
really an honor to sit here before you to discuss such an important issue. As you mentioned, I'm Senator Susan Rubio, and I was a teacher for 17 years. And I know that you just currently mentioned teen violence, I wanted to share that when I was a fifth grade teacher, I witnessed some of my fifth graders already starting to push each other, manipulate each other, and take their cell phones away, tell each other who they could hang out with. And so I think it's an important way to connect both, because teen violence does escalate and it leads to other things. So thank you so much again for this opportunity. First, I want to share some of the data. You've shared some of it already, but more than 1/3 of women and 1/4 of men experience physical, psychological, or sexual abuse by their partner during their lifetime. Law enforcement agencies in California respond to an average of 457 domestic violence calls every day. Across the country, an average of 50 women are shot to death by their partners every month. And the most dangerous time is not necessarily when you're in the relationship, but when victims decide to leave the relationship. Domestic violence also affects children. In fact, in my district, had the unfortunate, privilege of knowing one of my constituents whose husband could no longer control her, could no longer abuse her, so he took her 5-year-old little boy and killed him. And so when we think of domestic violence, we normally think of the victim, but there is the family impact as well. And that was very personal to me. I happen to know her personally, also an educator, and so we need to keep the families in mind as well. So I want to share a little bit. Intimate partner violence is very personal to me, because as it was well publicized that I am a survivor of domestic violence. And when my story broke, so many women that I didn't know came to me. I had hundreds of messages on Facebook. They found me every which way, and they wanted to tell their stories. And what I found in common was that paralyzing fear that victims feel. They feel they're trapped. They don't have a way out. They need support. And so I did decide that when I came to the Senate, that was going to be my number one issue. And so what I did last year, I authored a bill called the Phoenix Act. Victims usually have 3 years to bring their abusers to justice, and that's not enough time. Through my research, I found that most women take an average about 8 years to get over the trauma. And I don't think we take into consideration the post-traumatic stress that occurs. I had one victim come to me who was tied up for 4 days, and even though in that moment she wasn't physically abused, she was kept awake for 4 days. And so when she was out of that relationship, she was able to get help. And again, it took her 8 years to be able to speak about it. So when the law says that you have 3 years to realize you're a victim, realize how to navigate the legal system, and by the 3rd year, you have to have your abuser in court. That's unrealistic. So I set out to change the law and expand the statute of limitations. I had hoped for more years, but I'm happy to report that I was able to extend it from 3 years to 5 years. So victims have a little bit more time to heal. It's a very traumatic process for a victim. It's not only traumatic, but embarrassing if you're like myself, that I'm a public figure and you know that your life is going to be displayed all over the news media outlets. And so those 2 extra years, I think, helps, but I think we still need to do more. That is not enough. We need to really advocate to ensure that people understand that it's not just the abuse that really affects victims, but it's the aftermath, what you're dealing with after. And again, the trauma it's deep. And so when all the women were sharing with me, and I said hundreds of women were sharing with me their stories, it was, again, that fear of speaking out, the fear of people not believing their stories. And so it's really important that we look at the big picture. And the reason I say that now, because this year I'm working on another bill, SB 1141, and it has to do with coercive control. I think my frustration has been, and for many survivors, is that we believe that domestic violence or intimate partner violence has to do with physical signs, bruises on your face. But there's so much more that happens in domestic violence situations. It's not necessarily the physical assaults that traumatize you, but it's the coercive control of. I've been interviewing a lot of victims, and so I want to share some of their stories without naming them. And I shared one where this woman was tied up. She wasn't physically assaulted, but she was tied up and kept awake for 4 days. That is unacceptable. That was her trauma, not the physical assaults, but the trauma of not being able to go to sleep. There's other victims who share how their intimate partners prevent them from going to school or finishing their education. That has financial impact, not only to them, but to their children and their families. They get into their bank accounts and make sure that they don't have access to funding. They isolate them, don't let them hang out with their friends or see their families. So it comes in many different forms, but I think we need to start recognizing that it doesn't have to be visible. It doesn't have to be something that we can spot, but it's internal. And so what I want to do with this coercive control bill is really put in the forefront that domestic violence is not about physical signs, bruises, but it's everything that happens behind closed door and the manipulation that happens that can have, long-lasting effects on victims. And so I hope to be able to bring that to the Senate, the Assembly, and be successful, because even getting support from health providers in terms of counseling, how do we do that for victims when it's not even a recognizable assault on your person, when they're manipulating you, when they're incarcerating you, tying you up? And so I want to make sure that we give victims not only a way to seek help for their trauma, but also be able to use it as a defense. Currently, in courts, you're not allowed to tell your story in terms of that control. What they want to hear is the physical assault part, but it's that control factor that I think leads women to sometimes either snap or what we're finding, recently is that women are losing their children, and courts are not recognizing that they're traumatized. And so we want to make sure that the trauma is recognized as abused. I also, I'm working on SB 1088, which is domestic violence housing. We talk about homelessness. It's a big issue, but what we don't realize or recognize is that a lot of the victims, a lot of the homeless individuals were victims of domestic violence and had to flee. And many of them end up on the streets. When I did an analysis in my own community, there were about 4,200 homeless individuals, and about nearly 1,000 of them were connected to domestic violence. And so unless we start focusing on fixing the problem as it pertains to domestic violence, we're going to continue to have people out on the streets. And if we're always saying, why don't victims leave? And I heard it very often in my own case. Why don't you just walk away? If people understood how many factors are going through your mind, financial, and I was, I consider myself a well-educated individual, but it happens to everyone. And so the misconception is that someone could just walk away. You cannot just walk away. It doesn't happen that way. Again, it's that trauma that I want to highlight, that I want everyone to understand. The trauma is the most difficult thing to get over. And so hopefully I can bring some funding to domestic violence victims. And right now there's so many that are not able to find help and housing for themselves and their children. So hopefully we can help. I'm also working on another bill, which is SB 894, and it has to do with changing the statute of limitations for revenge porn. Victims also reported that their intimate partners were threatened to release intimate pictures of them. And that's how they kept them in fear. That's how they kept them in control. And so currently, victims of revenge porn have 1 year to bring their abuses to justice. And this would extend it from the time they find out. This has nothing to do necessarily always with abuse, but we know that when pictures are out there, sometimes they ruin job opportunities. Now we know that companies will go on people's Facebooks and will go on the internet just to find out what kind of person that person is. And just having your personal, intimate pictures out there is a violation. And so, again, my bill is going to extend the statute from the time the perpetrator puts it online to the time that the victim discovers the pictures are out there. Sometimes they don't find out till 2-3 years later. At that point, it's too late. So hopefully we can change the laws in that respect. And so I'm so honored to be here partnering with you because I really want to be a resource and vice versa. I want to make sure that you have me as a resource. I'm eager to see. I know that first of all, I want to thank the Commission for dedicating its time and resources to studying the issue of domestic violence. Like I said, it's such an important issue to me and to so many victims. And I used to say women, but through our studies, we're finding more and more that men are also victims. And it's increasing. The numbers are growing. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I hope that I continue to sit down with each and every one of you and work on real policy that's going to have a positive impact on our victims. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before I go to my commissioners, I should note that people who work with individuals who have lost their home in a fire will say that for those people, it often takes 2 years to 3 years before emotionally they are able to engage in the recovery process, submitting documents, filling out forms, being interviewed. So you are right. We do need to better understand and to take into consideration the harm that is invisible. It can't just be the bruises. We have to be cognizant of the impact of that emotional trauma and the implications of its control on someone. And with that, I believe Commissioner Varner.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for your bravery and for your leadership on this issue. And some of this legislation I think, can be very impactful, but one of the concerns that I've seen and from previous testimony that we've heard is the funding mechanism from Cal OES, and it just seems horribly inefficient when the agencies that are dealing with these problems get reimbursed from money from the federal government and from the state government, and they're having to finance the funds in order just to deploy them and pay for staff and pay for the services. So with this legislation, is there anything going on, or how can we be helpful in changing that? I'm not afraid to be more innovative on it and say that there really shouldn't be a reimbursement. If you've applied for a grant with CalOS and you've been approved, why do you have to now go back and prove again that you spent the money? I think there could be an audit, but that those funds should be deployed right away. And I know it's different with the federal government, but why not ask the questions and find a way that we can deploy those funds when the grant is approved?
Well, thank you for that question. The reality is that when it comes to any legislation here in this building, funding is always going to be the number one, topic of discussion. And getting things funded is, in my opinion, the most difficult thing there is. We had last year funding for, like I said, domestic violence victims housing, and that funding was taken away. So it's always like a tug of war in terms of priorities, but it's an issue that I want to continue to explore, and I don't have an answer for you right now, but it's, funding is always going to be a challenge in these cases.
If there's a way we can help, let us know. If there's some recommendation or something you've seen on the floor that we could be helpful from that perspective, let us know. And I just had one other quick question. You had talked about the impact on families, and we also heard testimony about the disconnect between the court system and the service providers, and that rehabilitation could be getting to the batterers even and teaching them because they may have grown up in a family of abusive relationships. And so is there any legislation or any attention to trying to provide a funding source for the court system to deal with batterers?
Well, what I have been doing, my personal work has been, I had a summit with all the local providers in my area, and that was a topic that we discussed, trying to figure out how do we also provide support to the perpetrators. And I know based on some of the stories that I've heard from victims that I interviewed is that it's a cycle. Yes, absolutely. They saw abused growing up. They were abused themselves, and so it becomes a cycle. So, I'm well aware, and also other providers, we're well aware that we can't just take care of the victims. I know that we have to do more on the other side and try to make sure that there is also not only funding to be able to take abusers for redirect their behavior, because one of the things that I found through my court case and through others is that there is no mandate when, for example, when I got a restraining order, which I currently have for 5 years, there is no mandate to send the person to therapy, counseling, try to redirect that behavior. And so right now we're exploring that element because there's really no avenue for them to go get help themselves. So we're really in the process of exploring that. When I had a summit with all the providers, we discussed we cannot necessarily just take care of the victim when it happens, but we need to figure out how to do preventative work and make sure that the perpetrators are also getting counseling. So again, it's a great question. I don't have an answer in terms of how do I get funding, but if we're exploring it and certainly want to do what we can to help the perpetrators get better themselves. But thank you for asking.
Senator, thank you so much for coming today. I happen to live in Los Angeles. I did read the profile. It's an extraordinary story, and we're thrilled to have you here today. I wanted to just building on this issue right here. I was a former federal prosecutor, and one of the things that people get when they are sentenced is they have to get restitution. So it might be an interesting avenue to add, in addition to restitution, you also have to go to counseling. So it would be part of maybe the sentencing that was required if somebody was sentenced to this type of violent crime. So just a thought of avenue. Doesn't cost any more money. It would just be that it was part of the sentencing mechanism. But actually, I also wanted to comment a little bit on your proposed bill, SB 1088, about homelessness. We had a conference with quite a number of providers, and interestingly, most people look at the homeless population as monolithic. And when we were all speaking about this, it became very clear that many of the people out on the street are victims. And none of the providers had any additional funds or funds carved out in order to make sure that there were certain homeless shelters that had the extra security necessary. So as you're talking about how difficult it is to get money, since we've just given so much money to the homeless issue, maybe it's to take what's already there and ask to set aside some so there's a little bit extra for the homeless shelters that are dealing with victims, because they need the shelter, but they just need shelter plus. But it may be a situation where there's so much money and it still is addressing that monolithic group, but not asking for more money, just how that money is applied to the issue. So just some thoughts.
No, thank you for those great suggestions, and I will definitely consider those. Thank you.
And we have some data on that because we had the panel. So to the extent that Crystal can help you with that, I'm sure we'd all be thrilled to share with you and see if that doesn't help to get you further on your way. We'd
Absolutely.
love to be your partner, as you said.
Any data, any information, I would be happy to. I'm going to have my staff reach out to ensure that we have that information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Byer?
Thank you for appearing. This issue is personal to me as well. A member of my extended family was for many years the subject of the non-physical abuse and control that you talked about so eloquently. And I tend to think of it as the modern equivalent of slavery. And if you think about it in that context, it's economic as well as physical, psychological as well as leaving marks. One of the tremendous advantages you have is the insight and knowledge from your personal experience, the credibility that you bring to it. Our challenge as a commission is most of the time we end up dealing with the mechanisms of policy. And I'm going to go through 8 of them. I'm not going to ask you to answer each of the 8, but the Office of Emergency Services witnesses might want to take notes. The challenge is how to best put together and package a series of reforms that individually may seem bureaucratic. Sean mentioned one which I'm very supportive of, which is pay now, review the grant-making capability of the organization, and then take the state money and use that as a front so that the service providers do not have to borrow money in anticipation of funding. That's a big deal. And if we recommended that, that could take on a lot of legislative time, but it could get in the way, even though I'm supportive of it, of other things. So any thought after the hearing from you would be great about, is OES the right home for this activity? Personally, I think it should be in the Office of the Surgeon General. Second, the misalignment between the goals set by the federal government in data collection and the needs of the state. The state hasn't articulated, in my view, a vision or a data collection methodology that's going to lead state policy. All we're doing is taking the federal money and following their mandates. The per organization allocation of funding seems misaligned with the nature of the organizations and what they do. It puts a limit on the creation of new organizations and the innovation that new organizations can bring. The advisory committee to give advice on this may be too insider in orientation. It's always good to have fresh voices and new ways of thinking about things. It's not clear to me that the 14 services that are mandated under law, all of them need to be delivered by every agency. Okay. We've got a structural problem that doesn't seem to be informed by the emotional and real fiscal needs of the service providers and the victims of intimate partner violence. And we can do a better job of aligning things. And I think your leadership will help the legislature figure out which of those ideas and many others we can pursue, what packages put together and how to deal with them. And as a commission, I know we're going to have to struggle with how much can people digest and when can they digest them. And so the last comment, and again, a comment on your leadership, by putting out legislation, you've put a marker down that you care deeply about this, and you're going to attack what seem to be smaller problems that are going to change the lives of real people. And so we look to you to evaluate our recommendations so that they aren't just bureaucratic, changing the deck chairs, but they're going to change the lives of victims. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I can just comment on what you said, thank you for all those recommendations. And I just want to make this comment really briefly. You know, when the Me Too movement occurred, I think it was last year or the year before, you know, it became such, you know, big national news, especially in this building. You know, we had everyone speaking about it, denouncing it, talking about it. But the interesting part is, you know, I don't think people want to help, but sometimes people are taught to not. It almost feels like it's something that happens behind closed doors. You shouldn't meddle with it. And the reason I say that, because a year before the Me Too movement occurred, I had taken my abuser to court. I have, you know, a competent judge found in my favor and issued a restraining order. And there wasn't a statement from this building on that issue, being that I was an elected official, being that he was an elected official. And so I think moving forward with small policies, in my view here, is starting to put it on the map, because it seems like no one wants to talk about domestic violence in the big picture. They want to be helpful. And so I think in years past, you know, 50s, 60s, I think even I growing up, you're always sort of taught that this is something that you just don't talk about. Even if you see your neighbor getting beat up, it's their business. You don't talk about that. And so my role here, and everything that you suggested, you know, thank you for suggesting, but I have to be the voice here, you know, and I want to be the loud voice that says it's okay to talk about it. Let's start there, because some people don't want to talk about it. And it's okay to try and help a victim. You're not meddling in a personal issue. This is a serious crisis that we're having. And now with the internet and with cell phones, which we didn't have in the past, and I think when we think of coercive control, people are not very willing to move forward. I tried last year, and they weren't very accepting of it. I understand. But years past, we didn't have a cell phone, we didn't have internet, we didn't have revenge porn. Now we have to start shifting our brain and thinking in terms of the future with internet, the ability for abusers to go into the internet and violate, the personal space of the victim. All that was not something we have to deal with in the past. Now it's here, and so I'm going to continue to be that loud voice, and hopefully we can continue to change minds. But baby steps for me is very significant because 2 years ago, no one wanted to talk about it. Even when my case broke, this building, we didn't have any statements coming out of this building, and so I'm really trying to make sure that I'm that person that's putting this issue in the forefront and making sure that we understand how serious it is. And even if, again, we talked about the physical signs, the bruises, there's so many victims right now that are just not being beat up or assaulted, but they're being abused in other mental ways. And so I'm just here to ensure that we all hear how serious the issue is. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you, Senator. I understand that you've got another commitment that you have to attend. Yes, and I don't want you to be too late.
It should be okay. I want to thank you really for coming today. This has been most helpful. I guess you started off by giving us some data from the research you've done, which, if I calculated it correctly, there are around 150,000 calls that come in every year, at least, right, that we know about, okay? The state of California, in its own general fund, has been putting in $20 million a year for domestic violence, right? $20 million. And there are 150,000 calls that come in every single year. I guess this commission doesn't normally go back to doesn't recommend to the legislature or to the administration about funding, meaning we suggest you put in blank number of dollars. But I think that it's time, given your point, the last point you made, which is nobody wanted to talk about this in this building, it certainly is reflected in the amount of money that's not coming into this very important problem. Right, and so it seems to me that we need to figure out a way, right, with data, right, because there obviously is a lack of data to tell us something, right, so that we can start talking about what's the size of the population that's being victimized, so that we could then maybe start addressing what the needs are financially in order to help the community, right, be able to fight this. We've heard from so many of the community-based organizations their struggles, right, and their comments to us to say, the more people the more people we identify as victims, if we don't have services to refer them to, what good is it to identify them as victims? Right, it just puts them in a more precarious position. So I'm hoping that you'll talk to your colleagues, particularly the Women's Caucus, about this, because I think it's time for them to start speaking up with you, right, and alongside of you, to be able to say this is an important issue for all of us.
And lastly, I just want to say, because, I did say, no one wants to talk about it. I want to be clear. There's a lot of advocates, a lot of people that want to pursue policy and have pursued policy. But I guess I'm trying to put a human face to the issue so we can go a little further, because we need to go further with this. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Senator. If you could call the next witness, please.
Mr. Chairman, the next witness is Gina Buccieri-Harrington, who is the Assistant Director for Grants Management at the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. She's been in that position for more than a decade and is responsible for the administration of approximately $807 million in funds for various topics. As commissioners know, $807 million for many different Homeland Security and many other policy areas. As the commissioners know, OES is the chief funder of survivor organizations through the state. You also have printed before you the OES written testimony, which they submitted. We didn't have it in time to include it in the packet last week, but it's in front of you now. So, Ms. Buccieri-Harrington.
Thank you and welcome.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Gina Buccieri-Harrington, and I am the Assistant Director, and thank you for that introduction. My roles and responsibilities at Cal OES is I am over all of Homeland Security, Emergency Management, Victim Services, and Criminal Justice funding that comes through us through state and federal funding. I have with me Leigh Bills. She is over our Victim Services branch, and her role and responsibility is to oversee all our victim services programs. So she is my expert witness here, and as details, if there's anything that I can't answer or we can't answer, we will be sure to get back to you with whatever questions that you have. We did get submitted some questions, and so my testimony is going to be based on those. I'm highlighting that information, and in your testimony there, the written is more in depth, because I didn't want to have to read 15 pages to you, and I'm sure you didn't want to hear me read 15 pages. Also, there's some attachments there that will be referenced from those questions.
And just so the commissioners are aware, the attachments were rather lengthy. We will provide those to you, but we did not print them out. They were about 90 pages, I believe. So we have that information and can give it to you.
And I want to make sure that, that I express this. In the event that you're interrupted by commissioners, you should take that as a compliment.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. Any questions that you have throughout this, please. Cal OES's mission is broad. It's to protect lives, build capacities, support communities for a more resilient California. As an all-hazard emergency management agency, Cal OES is committed to preventing, preparing for, mitigating against, responding to, and helping all Californians recover from all disasters and human-caused incidents. Cal OES has a special commitment to supporting victims of crime and has incorporated these programs in its overall mission. For the purpose of this testimony, I'm going to be using intimate partner violence, IPV, and domestic violence interchangeably. Cal OES administers both federal and state funding to local government and community-based organizations to address intimate partner violence. These programs provide direct services such as shelter, crisis intervention, legal assistance, transportation, emergency food, and clothing. Some of our funding also provides...
To interrupt you?
Yes.
Okay. As we're going through this discussion, one of the things that's very interesting to me is to understand if I'm a provider, I know that the way that the grants operate is that what the providers have indicated to me is that most of them take out a line of credit to cover the 40% that the state handles versus the money coming from the feds. And then they send in their receipts, and then you guys reimburse, something that Commissioner Werner was talking about as well. What I'd like to understand is, what is that process? I mean, they were saying it could take a long time. And so if I was to be the provider and I've taken out my line of credit, which of course I have to pay interest on that line of credit.
Absolutely.
So what is the process? Is there room in your view for streamlining that process, and or is there room for, as Commissioner Varner, Vice President Varner had suggested, what would be the problem of giving the money up front? So I'm very curious about that, because time, the value of money is very important. The ability to get it as quickly as possible is very important. So I'm very curious about how it operates for you and your thoughts about trying to change it. What are the obstacles you see?
I can give you an overall. Right, currently, state law allows us to give an advance up to 25%, and that can be asked at the beginning of the grant cycle. We also, in response to those reimbursements, if a agency is in need of a reimbursement, we do offer expedited through the system, so they do not have to wait the mandated 45 days. And I don't know if is there anything that I'm missing in that process?
No, I think that we do offer advances up to 25% per the law. That's what we're allowed to offer at this point. And the 45 days doesn't include mailing time, so that can add to the experience of the provider in terms of, they may say it takes longer than 45 days because it doesn't include mailing time on either side. Gina was probably going to mention that we're piloting an email submission. So
yes, and we're piloting an email submission for electronically receiving the reimbursements, so it would help shorten the length of time as far as processing goes.
And the email process right now, that's just a pilot project.
for the next 3 months, we're piloting. We want to work the bugs out before we open it up to all of the subrecipients. And that's not just IPV providers. That's all victim service providers.
Yes.
So we're giving it a little time so that we can hopefully work out our administrative bugs before everyone.
It doesn't include sending the check out.
That is handled by SCO, the
Yes.
State Controller's Office.
Yes.
So, and let me ask you a question. Are you having any conversations with IT to maybe understand, not even an email, but actually submit electronically the entire application? So that, because my understanding of, even though you're moving to email, you get the email and then you still have to input all the information. So it seems like maybe if we were to partner with the state, organization that handles all of the engineering and IT, we could actually have people implement their information, and that would also maybe be a path towards saving money.
We are currently looking into that. We are looking at shortening the time for reimbursement, but as far as advances go at the beginning, we get very minimal requests for advances at this time. So I just wanted to let you know that we do offer it, and we do the expediting process. It does shorten the period quite a bit as far as they can offer like 30 days or 5 days as far as the.
We have several options for expediting payments through SCO, where we pay a little bit of state general fund and they can do overnight, or they can, but that still doesn't eliminate the mailing time to the subrecipient. If we say get it out tomorrow and they're in Southern California, it still may take a little bit of time.
I'm very curious about something you just said, and you said you get very few people asking.
Yes.
Why, in your view, why is that?
I don't have, we offer it, but we have not had a lot. We can actually find out what the numbers are as far as those advancements go, but we do offer it. So I don't know, I don't have an opinion on why, but we can let you know exactly how many do. But they are aware of it through our process and our training.
Can I follow up?
Yeah,
on
sure.
that? So, a caveat.
Yes.
You guys have a really hard job. I appreciate what you're doing. Don't take any of these questions personally.
Absolutely.
I did a calculation. The state money that we're talking about, $20 million, is 0.000000001% of the agency's total budget. That, to me, makes a lot of argument for having another agency. Not because you can't do it, but because it is, by definition, a very low priority given the amount of money that's involved. And it gets in the way of focusing on innovation in the delivery of services for this important topic. That's not personal. It seems as though there are other people who could fix some of the administrative problems that Commissioner Sidley is talking about, because it would be a bigger deal to them. And I don't want to take away your time and attention for earthquake preparedness, radio notifications, fire response. All those things are vital, but this responsibility was allocated in a way that didn't put the victim's perspective or the service providers as the top priority. And no one's blaming you for how you administer the money, but it's such a small thing. Does it really belong in your office?
Absolutely, it does.
What's the rationale?
The rationale is, and I have given this rationale many of times, we look at victims holistically at Cal OES, whether you're a victim of a natural disaster or a victim of a violent crime. And we serve all victims, and our priority is all of our victims that we have. And our staff on the victim services side are completely committed to the violent crime. Governor Ducey we have expanded on our victim services programs to mass violence, and also on our domestic violence, or on our disasters. We have staff that are out in the field and deployed during disasters and dealing with victims of who have lost everything due to a fire or a flood or an earthquake. So yes, it does. And we, as far as the processing of, like I said, we are limited by state to only be able to advance 25% of the funds. That doesn't mean that we won't, or we haven't, but we
But if you don't publicize the program and you don't proactively do it, no one's going to apply. And you indicated earlier that you couldn't tell us how often it happened, which indicates that you're not paying a lot of attention to it.
Commissioner, we have our trainings that we give to our subrecipients. We have our subrecipient handbook that specifically specifies how to do an advance.
But you're living in the 20th century with respect to the application process of a pilot project for emails, which is 20 years behind the times, and no online applications. The federal government is way ahead of you in grant making and ease of service providers receiving, advance reimbursement. I'm sorry, it's not acceptable that we're talking about snail mail as the norm, and that we're talking about processing time that is weeks and months, and that the service providers are borrowing money, taking away from their ability to deliver services in order to wait to collect money on a reimbursement-only basis. Just doesn't make any sense.
I think the checks and mailing out is a conversation to have with the SEO, with the State Controller's Office, because we do not have control over what and them submitting the checks out. We do have a 45-day Prompt Payment Act, which gives us 30 days by law and gives the SEO 15 days to process.
David, if I may, and then when I know we cut you off, but when we had the round table, many of the participants at the table, I just want to say, we're very, very supportive of having the victims and their work where it is currently sits, with changes, and they made suggested changes. One of the big changes, and I think it's important for you to know, and I will say, you had people at this roundtable as well, so this isn't new, but when there is a fire or some other catastrophe that befalls everybody, basically everyone in the office goes out into the field, and then you rotate people. And so what the domestic violence, intimate partner violence establishment sort of felt is that their people go too. So I think what you're suggesting and what needs to be sort of addressed here by pointing out how small the budget is like it has to be dedicated. So if there's a fire, like right now the whole building is dedicated to the fire. Well, that then says that this isn't a priority. So I think what we need to do is get to a path where if it moves or it stays or whatever, like it still exists. If California's burning down, well, so are these victims burning down, and you have to deal with them. You cannot put them off because their life's in danger. So I just wanted to share that.
And
Now, I know Commissioner Varner has been waiting to say something, but that's quite all right. But what I also want to say to you is if you hear us telling you something that doesn't comport with what you're doing in your operations, you need to disabuse us. If we are wrong, I'm serious. If we are wrong, no, I'm watching your faces, and sometimes there's some tortured expressions that come across. So if we have an impression that is inaccurate, this is an opportunity. You don't need to tell us that we're wrong. You might want to say, I have some other information. And with that, Commissioner Varner.
Just following up on this 25% potential upfront of the grant that you'd give them, what are the conditions to that? Are they overwhelming? Is that why these providers are not taking advantage of it?
Sure. So how it works currently is you may request up to 25% of your state allocation, and then that money is taken off of reimbursement requests over the next two submissions. So for most of the CBOs in the IPV world, we're looking at monthly submissions. So month two and the first month and the second month, they would be taking that money back to ensure that that money is spent. And the reason it is that way is because we also fund a large number of government organizations that submit quarterly. So they only have 4. So we want to make sure that the advance we've given them has been spent prior to those other funds going out. So that is an area that we could look at in terms of, is it too cumbersome to take it back?
Is that the use it or lose it type of mentality? Like if they don't use it within it, so that's why they're not taking advantage of it, because if they don't expend those funds within that period of time on
I don't know for certain, but I've been working with these programs for 20 years now. Prior to that, I worked in domestic violence shelters and in a district attorney's office as a DV advocate. And I will say that I know that these programs struggle financially, and I know that the folks working in them are tremendously committed, and it's incredibly difficult work. And I think that for Cal OES, anything we can do to alleviate that, we're looking for ideas. Gina started to talk about our online system, and we've been working with we have a contract that's building a system for us that will eventually do online submission of applications and payments. We're not there yet. The state of California is a very slow boat to turn, but we are making progress, and that is our ultimate goal, because it would be easier on them, and quite frankly, it would be easier on us if we weren't dealing with so much paper in a mail room.
As Commissioner Byer indicated, there are broader topics to tackle here, but with regard to this specific issue, I know you've referenced by law we can do these certain things, and the Little Hoover Commission was put together to find efficiencies in government, and like I mentioned before, I think this process is horribly inefficient. I don't understand why you apply for a grant, then you have to then go back and say, hey, we did everything right, now can we get reimbursed? And then they get an audit on top of that. It seems like there's a step that could be totally eliminated, and it would take a burden off of your staff as well. So if you have recommendations from a practical perspective that where you think that the process from a legislative perspective, we can be helpful on that, we'd love to hear that.
Well, the reimbursement process was set up for checks and balances, for expenditures, for not necessarily our budgets. When you first apply for a grant, are the budgets exactly the way they're going to be for that whole year? Modifications are made, changes are made, staff aren't hired. So the reimbursement process is a way to check and balance to make sure that what is being spent on is exactly what they have been told us that they were spending it on.
Do you have a follow-up?
Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, from a practical perspective, that's what an audit would be for. So they would be risking future funding through an audit if they didn't apply the funds within the bounds of the law. So I don't understand why you need that extra step when you can just do the audit at an annual audit.
Yes.
That is absolutely true with state funds. So for the state funds, we could, if the law allowed, we could advance all of the money. Federal funds, that is not the case, because we have the Code of Federal Regulations and all of the rules that come in there in terms of what we're required to do in monitoring. And over the years, we have the $20 million that you referenced in state funds that I think most of that transferred to Cal OES in 2009. Prior to that, it was over at the Department of Public Health. And we have augmented that with the federal funds, which is probably more than half. I think it's a $54 million program. So more than half of the money that supports the domestic violence program, this shelter-based program in California, is half federal. So we have to apply those federal rules, unless we were to split out the money and have the state money go out in one award and the federal money go out in another award. And we have certainly considered that, but then you have two applications that they're going to have to submit. So we've worked with the field a lot in terms of what's better for you. Is it better to combine the money and have, there's two issues, one application every year where you submit it and you get both these pots of money in the same thing. The other thing that's really great about having the money combined, which subjects kind of all of the money to the federal rules, is that the state money can match the federal money. So federal money comes with match requirements. And for our biggest fund source, the Victims of Crime Act Victim Assistance Program, it's 20% total project costs, which you don't want to try to understand because it's not 20% straight. It's very confusing. And we do offer match waivers to an extent, but the state money being combined with federal money in any grant program is very valuable because it meets the match for that program, which takes the burden off the local entity to come up with in-kind match, donations, volunteers, whatever it is they have to come up with. So that is why we have gone to this route, and that is why now all of the money is subject to the Code of Federal Regulations. But it is not lost on us, and it is not something that we don't talk about in terms of if we were to split those out, this state money would have very few restrictions because the federal money comes with, a book like this full of restrictions that, quite frankly, we spend a ton of time trying to interpret and understand and implement. So these small nonprofits, we have to give a lot of technical assistance for them to understand because it's hard. It's cumbersome.
I would be very curious to know your results of the audits. And, are you finding problems? Because if you're not really finding problems, it seems to me that we are seriously in a world of redundancy. The dollar amounts relative to how much the state budget is, $20 million, is a mere pittance. And it seems like we're spending twice that much just to make sure that the $20 million was okay. So I'd be very curious to see like the last 10 years of audits to try to understand from a data perspective, are we overdoing it? Or if there really is a problem that we're trying to address. And much of what we do is we make recommendations based on this data. And so it may be that the data is showing like, well, maybe we can push the money out the door and go with what the commissioner is suggesting is stopping all this audits, and you do one time and whatever. Or maybe the first year, if somebody's new, you do that this way, their audits, see if they really got it. But somebody who's been in the program 20 years, I'm guessing they've got it down. And we're just driving them crazy. And they should be able to serve the victims that they need to serve. So,
Commissioner Stromberg.
So I think you might have started to answer this question I had, but so does the federal law prohibit changes that would allow for, say, an advance, or, so I'm kind of wondering if our regulations are going to end up being targeted toward the 20 million and maybe other processes, or is there something we can do with the federal money? Can that be advanced, for example?
So the federal money can be advanced. It comes with the restriction, and this is where it's kind of legalese and we struggle to interpret it, but if we advance that money, they have to get it out the door within what is considered a reasonable amount of time for standard accounting principles. What does that mean? That's kind of where it gets lost, but it is strongly recommended that we function on a reimbursement basis because of the issues of people not expending the money appropriately. Now, in terms of the issue of, I firmly believe that 99.999% of our service providers are doing it right. Occasionally, we have had folks who have significant fraud going on. We have had people who have ended up in jail, federal prison as well, because of fraud with these programs. So it's not unheard of, but it is, infrequent. In my 20 years, I think we have had 2 agencies that have been abolished and people have gone to jail for a significant fraud and embezzlement. But, that's 2 over 20 years of administering 100 and some programs in just this little program alone.
So I'm the subject of Pedro's comments, so I'm going to ask you a bunch of yes/no questions about whether I've got the facts right. So the totality of what gets administered, 84 million?
For interpersonal or for
Yeah,
intimate
yeah.
partner violence, yes.
Okay.
More than that, but yes.
There are roughly 100 providers.
No. So there are
100 major, what I'll call general contractors. The recipients, not the sub-recipients. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Our sub-awards, there's 369 that provide some measure of IPV.
Okay,
300,
well,
and that's...
I'm relying on staff who said it was about 100. So
We were referring to about 100 DVAP recipients, is that correct?
So there are 102 sub-awards, but some of them receive multiple sub-awards. I think it's, if I recall correctly, 5 of them receive more than one sub-award.
okay, so they're one recipient with 5 grants. Okay, I'm just trying to do some math.
Yeah.
So 100 people. If they're applying for this 25%, and they're doing it on a monthly basis, which is what you said, right?
Most of them elect to bill
Okay,
pay monthly.
Okay, so but if you were applying for a month, that'd be $70,000. Check my math. 84 divided by 100 divided by 12 is $70,000. You can see why you might not want to apply if it's bureaucratically complicated. What's the process for a new organization becoming eligible? Is it possible?
Becoming eligible to be a subrecipient? Is
Yes.
that the question?
Yes. How hard is that?
The programs that we have, the 102 by statute, by penal code, cannot compete again for funds. We can only increase the amount of subrecipients in the DV program if there's more funds available. When we got an increase of VOCA funds in 2015, per my testimony and in yours, we expanded 10 new programs for competitive process to allow those domestic violence, IPV programs, to be able to apply under different programs. So I'm not...
I guess what I'm getting at is if if I wanted to create a new nonprofit, it'd be really hard to qualify and it would take a long time. That's my point. Because there's no new money.
So I think we're confusing two separate issues. We have federal money for intimate partner violence that funds a variety of programs, for example, the Domestic Violence Housing First. And Cal OES chose to put the money, the additional money for domestic violence, or IPV, into other programs, because then the folks don't have to do the 14 services that are identified, right? That was written a long time ago. Sometimes those don't fit with what folks actually want to do, what they think their communities need. So we have the $20 million that goes to the DV, or previously called the DVAP program. And then we have all of this other money that is for interpersonal violence. And we put a significant increase into the DV program to bring that all up to kind of a workable amount for them. For years, these folks ran these programs on a shoestring budget they couldn't even begin to do those things. So that money, and that's what Gina was kind of referencing, goes to some of them are brand new folks. They came to Cal OES. When we got the increase, we took on 200 or plus brand new subrecipients. But that is with the federal money, not the state money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but if I'm in Los Angeles and I want to serve 2,000 people, and the recipient next door, who's been in the program for 10 years, is serving 200, we get the same amount of money, right?
Yes, that was a recommendation of a work group back in 2010-11. So we brought the actual.
Help me understand how that makes any sense.
Okay, I will. I'll tell you.
Please don't defend it. Tell me
Okay.
what you think personally, whether that makes any sense. 1,000 recipients versus 200 recipients.
Sure, I will. And I will tell you that I was on the work group, and we very much set out to give a formula based on some criteria. We looked at other states. We looked at what services are most important. So we started and we said, okay, let's look at shelter nights. Yeah. And then someone brought up very importantly that in some rural areas, maybe shelter nights aren't as valuable because they have to spend so much on transportation to get to the victims. And then we said, well, some folks think counseling's most important, so they put most of their money there. So at the end of the day, and you have the report which you can read, which will chronicle all of our discussions and the recommendation that was eventually made to the Domestic Violence Council. These were DV program providers who were on this committee. This was not other folks. They came together.
It wasn't victims who said, okay, I want to be able to have some differentiation because the provider I want to go to is in a largely populated area that has specialty in this particular thing. You've described a formula devoid of input from the victim community that's 10 years old.
It is 10 years old.
And it's devoid of victim participation.
Certainly. We have not included victims in the discussion.
So if we look at the 102 programs, what are the cost of the audits of those programs per unit?
My recollection of looking at budgets, which I haven't done in years, is that they do range. I would give an estimate of anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000 a year for an annual audit, depending on the size of the program and what the requirement is, if it's a single program audit or the different requirements.
So that's a yearly audit for all of those?
Yes. So annually they will do an audit, and there is definitely an expense that goes with that.
And then is there a difference between the federal and the state audits of those monies?
There is no difference in the audit. There is a difference in how much money you can use towards the audit. So the Code of Federal Regulations has rules around how much of the grant funding, their grant funding of the federal money, you can use towards an audit. So some of these agencies may have to find other money to, if we're talking about the 102 that get the state money, there is no requirement on the amount they can use for the audit. They can fully cover their audit with state funds. But with federal funds, there is a rule.
So where else would they go to get the money?
Local. Sometimes there's local. Now, with the federal, again, we have federal and we have state, right? So the state money doesn't come with these rules, but the federal money comes, the biggest pot of money comes with a stipulation that these agencies are solvent, that this is not their sole source of money. And what they consider solvent if I'm recalling correctly, is at least 10% of their budget has to come from a non-federal source. So those kinds of rules. Now, the state money doesn't have that rule. It has many, many fewer rules, which is why we have toyed with the idea over the years of pulling that out and saying, here's your state money. This is linked to the 14 core services in penal code. And the federal money, it can be used for different things. Now, it gets very complicated because the federal money can't be used for any prevention efforts, whereas the state money can. So it's a complicated kind of balancing act for these subrecipients.
My final question, what about doing spot audits so we don't do them yearly, but they have to be done within a certain time frame so they don't know when they're coming?
Well, we at Cal OES, besides them doing their own audits, we have a monitoring compliance division that does a plan every year, and we have a formula that we use for high risk that's put into a plan. So our monitoring unit goes out and does compliance reviews. In addition to our staff, also do site visits, and they go out and do programmatic site visits on a yearly basis.
Thank you.
Does the feds require an audit and the state requires an audit? Or is it one
So
for both?
audits are done by the agency. They get a CPA to do their own audit. We don't do audits.
Right.
We do monitoring activities, which for the federal money that goes to IPV is a requirement. So when we accept this money, we say we will do these things and we will monitor them. We will have a risk assessment plan, all of those things. Now, the audits are actually done internally. They choose their CPA, they have an audit.
And the feds acknowledge those audits and you acknowledge those audits?
The feds, I'm not sure what you mean by acknowledge. We receive them, and we have a team that looks at them. The federal government does not look at our subrecipient audits. They couldn't begin to.
But those audits are required to be turned in. I mean, they pick their own auditor.
Yes.
But we are requiring
Yes.
the audits, so that's.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So just to follow up, so the state auditor is not involved in this process?
No.
No, they choose.
yeah, please.
So the 14 requirements are state requirements in the Penal Code of the State of California. They're not federal requirements, so they could be changed. How come they haven't, and what we heard from some of the testimony in the meeting we had, was that maybe they're not all quite up to date, they're not recognizing what's going on in the 21st century. Has there been any discussion regarding going to the legislature and saying we'd like to update these so to reflect what's really going on in the community?
I would, are you going to be hearing from the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence? Because they can speak much more on this subject. I know there has been discussion in the field and there has been talk of it, but it's a complicated issue. So
Yeah, but
We
you all-
did, they testified in October.
Right.
We can give that
I'm
testimony
just
to you.
trying to remember, but you all haven't gone and said we think things need to be changed from what your perspective is.
We have not.
We have not.
All right.
I wanted to address the part about when we're deployed. One of the things we do, we have a new process that we have put in place because we are talking about process changes. And one of the issues that had been brought up was when we are deployed or we are on activation, how do we keep the wheels turning in making sure we get the money out the door? And one of the things we do, and that's basically where I come into play, is my job is to monitor who goes out and who comes in to make sure, because our responsibility is not only to IPV and domestic violence, but all our victim services programs. And as Leigh said, that we allow on our victim services side, especially our CBOs, to submit monthly for their reimbursements as our government agencies submit quarterly, because we know we're more sensitive on the CBOs that they need to get their money in to pay payroll and such. So one of the things we've instituted is what on deployments is we put together we've created a process that requires it's called a workload summary. So anybody that's deployed, they put together before they leave where they are in their process, whether they're looking at budgets, whether there's applications that need to be processed. And so that way, when who's ever left can monitor and take over to make sure. We have to say, knock on wood, no doors have closed due to deployments or activations. So we are constantly being able to move staff around to make sure we cover and process whatever applications we have. So that's a new process that we've put in place. and I wanted to address that. So I want to talk a little bit about the allocation of our federal funds. Cal OES has 3 advisory bodies. We have the Victims of Crime Act Steering Committee, we have the Violence Against Women Act Implementation Plan Committee, and we have the Children's Justice Act. Those 3 governing bodies help us in determining the gaps in services statewide, and those recommendations are then given to Director Ghilarducci to make final approval. Do I have any questions about our advisory committees? 2 of them are statutory. 1 of them is highly recommended, which is our VOCA Steering Committee. And that's where we got our increase in funding on our victim services side.
Yeah, Commissioner Aaroner.
So you have a committee, you have a group that's looking forward, right? So have they did they do a needs assessment? We heard from the senator, right, that 150, 160,000 calls come in a year. That says to me it's a significant population, right? So if you looked at, data would tell you, I guess if you were doing a needs assessment, it's not just a question of where the gaps must be enormous, given the number of people that are making phone calls. So do you have a report that shows where the gaps are, and has it been delivered to the administration and to the legislature?
We don't have a specific report for IPV itself. We looked at, the committee looked at all victimizations and gaps. It is domestic violence, as Senator Rubio spoke of, is very prevalent, right? It overwhelms all of our systems, victim service providers, law enforcement. It's overwhelming. So we haven't looked at that. However, Blue Shield Foundation did do... They are? Okay, great. Well, they did a needs assessment, which was very, very helpful in identifying what survivors want. So what does the penal code say we have to do versus what survivors want? So we have utilized that, and in that guided us quite a bit in the decision to implement programs like domestic violence housing first, the marginalized, innovative practice to marginalized victims communities, those kind of programs where we're getting away from old school thinking of shelter, counseling, support groups, and saying what do survivors need, and letting the programs tailor them that way. So their needs assessment definitely influenced us. In terms of our committee, we brought all of there was a Vision 21 report from the federal government, there was the Blue Shield, all of those were taken to the committee to review before they identified priorities for funding. In addition to the steering committee's making guidance, the federal money comes with rules about how much money needs to be used for different things. So again, it's kind of a balancing act for us in terms of making sure we're staying eligible for the funding, because we must commit 10% to child abuse, 10% to domestic violence, 10% to sexual assault, and also filling gaps.
I have another question. So I know we're here to focus on the state of California and how we operate, but we did hear at one of the other hearings that the federal money is, it's not consistent. And so I am curious as to how you as an organization handle that inconsistency. Seems like consistent, because there is some consistency that the state is only putting in $20 million, but the inconsistency is about what the feds are putting in.
Sure.
And that would severely impact, if I'm trying to provide services, I've got a huge problem if next year the money is not there. If you could explain to me how you sort of handle that, if you have anything to do with it at all, and also how far out are these federal funds? So when do you know that you're going to have a drop in funding?
Well, let me answer that first. We with our new programs, our new sub-recipients, we try to do the 3 to 5 year projection on sustainability for them, because it's important. We can't just fund them from 1 year, expect them to hire, get a program, especially new ones, and get them operational in 1 year. It just doesn't work. So yes, it's very hard to manage sustainability with programs when you're not sure from year to year. As you all are aware, we had a huge increase in funding in 2015 with our VOCA funds. So that allowed us to not only expand, but have the longevity of programs go a little further. Now, do we know exactly how much we're getting on a year-to-year basis? Not really. We kind of do, but until we get our notice of funding opportunity, we don't exactly know what that funding is going to be. But our projections, because the federal funds is a year plus 2. We don't have 1 year just to spend the funds. So we're able to continue with the programs we have, do our projections for the years so we can sustain them for at least 3 to 5 years. That's important to us. But as you know, the funding can go up and down.
But you do have some consistency for 3 years, basically.
Yes.
So on a 3-year basis.
But we make sure that they understand up front, due to the budgets, we can't promise it, of course, but we do try for 3 years to plan out at least 3 years to 5. And then
So that's a lot of what I spend my time doing is looking at the money and kind of, the shell game of terms of some of our money for intimate partner violence, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, that federal money, that has the year plus 2. The VOCA has a year plus 3. The STOP money has a year plus 2 plus a year, they offer an extension. So they're all a little different. But the important thing for us is to look at sustainability. So when we got the huge increase, how much of that do we give out the first year so that if all of a sudden it plummeted, we would have money in reserve to keep going to slowly ramp down. That's important to us. I mean, these projects, the first year we had this increase, a lot of our projects were very hesitant to hire staff because we weren't sure it was going to be sustainable. But we are able to let them know that we are releasing the money incrementally. A ton of money went out because we got such a huge increase, but incrementally enough so that if next year the crime victim fund dried up and there was no money, that we wouldn't go straight down, that it would be a gradual decline. The other thing Gina spoke about is with all of the new programs that we've developed, which was so exciting for the field, the Domestic Violence Housing First is huge for IPV. Those programs we have committed to, and if we see a reduced amount of funding, we will be able to do that through the next competitive cycle, so that what we don't want to do, and this was before the increase, this was true of all of our programs, if it has a whole lot of programs that are horribly insufficiently funded, right? So they don't have enough money to even have 3 or 4 staff. That's not what we want. So we're that's basically what I spend a lot of my time doing, is making sure that we have money long enough that if the fund dried up, one of the many 9 federal fund sources we had, that it wouldn't be catastrophic for service providers.
And I understand it is decreasing.
It is decreasing. I think next year for the biggest fund source, we're expecting, is it a 33% decrease back down to the 210 level? That's the projection. Until it comes out into the award, we won't know for sure. But yes, we are expecting a decrease.
And just let me tell commissioners, when you speak, make sure your mic is on so it gets picked up. Would you like to?
yes, or any other questions before I can proceed with?
Commissioner Arner, do you want to? You got your hand on the button? Okay.
He's just coaching me.
Go ahead.
So let's talk a little bit about the funding formula. That more than half of all funding for intimate partner violence administered through Cal OES goes through our domestic violence program. The Domestic Violence Advisory Council, which we have, is not one of our federal fund advisory boards, but it's actually a council. And it is administers the DV program, and it's under Penal Code 13823.16. Members are appointed by the governor, the Senate Rules Committee, and the Speaker, the Speaker of the Assembly. So we do have the Domestic Violence Advisory Committee that helps us with recommendations for funding decisions and gaps in services in the domestic violence program. We talked
Ask
a little.
question on that real quick?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So the council advises on the funding, and I got confused, and maybe you answered this, so I apologize if I'm going back. But I read in your report also that it's equal funding to each of the agencies.
Yes.
So what does the council advise on?
You wanted to?
Sure. So the council actually back in 2009, 10, or maybe it was 11, suggested that we create the committee. That was the funding formula report that you will see. And then it was presented to the council and they voted to recommend it, which was then taken up to the director at Cal OES. I don't believe it was Director Gallucci at the time, but that director approved it.
So is that fund, so the council now just approves that same mechanism every year, or
So-
how often do they meet? And
So they do meet quarterly when a quorum is available to Cal OES. So sometimes we don't have enough folks and there's no need to spend state resources to bring folks together that can't vote. But they do meet quarterly, and the funding formula, the level funding is still the path that I believe this committee would recommend. It hasn't been revisited. If the committee chose to revisit it, we certainly would. If they wanted a new committee, we would certainly create a new committee and do the exercise again.
so just for clarity too, in your report, you have the subawards, the various subawards all the way through. Are those all equal funding, or based on some of these awards, would they go, so for instance, Housing First, some of the agencies don't have shelters, right? So would
Right.
they still get funding under that subaward?
So the shelter component is funded under the DV program. That is the only program for interpersonal intimate partner violence that we require a shelter. The other ones may elect to have a shelter. They may elect to use the money that way, but they are not required. So DV Housing First, any of the other marginalized victims, specialized emergency housing, they're not required to have a shelter, but they could if they chose.
And those 10 are all, those were competitive RFPs.
Okay, so that's not part of the
DV
equal,
program.
okay.
No, that is not.
But most of them are level funded. Most of them are in the same situation where you compete for the same amount of money.
And generally speaking, is it it's the same agencies for how many years? Are the same agencies been getting?
Sure. So for the domestic violence assistance program, we've had 99 of the same agencies for decades. And then in 2010-11, the date is in the report because I'm going from memory here, we brought on, at the recommendation of the Domestic Violence Advisory Council, we opened it up competitively because we had additional funding and brought on 4 new agencies. One of those is one of the agencies I spoke of earlier that is no longer in existence, which is what takes us to the 102. So the last time we went competitive to open up the program was 2010-11, I believe.
And that is a shelter-based. The other 10 programs, those are in operation for 3 to 5 years, and then we go out competitive again. So those aren't ongoing programs. That was based on the increase in our VOCA funds. We were able to expand.
But those 3 to 5 year programs, are they generally the same agencies?
We have quite a few service providers that compete, and they are generally successful. But like I said, we brought on more than 200 brand new agencies since 2015.
Yes, and I want to also refer you, every year we do the Joint Legislative Budget Committee report, which is all of our victim services programs, performance of them for the year, and it also includes every single grantee that we fund and an overview of what those programs are. And that's posted on our website, and we
This year's isn't posted yet.
not yet. We haven't posted this year's, but we are about to. But that's something that you could refer to as far as all our victim services programs that we have.
And that's attachment A, which will be provided to you, which just is the intimate partner violence programs. So instead of looking at the whole 200-page document, you've been provided just the ones that are related to this.
Out of that report.
I'm curious on the competitive RFPs. Where's that funding come from?
That's coming from our, it's probably VAWA's on there too, but VOCA, our largest fund is our VOCA program, and majority of those programs are coming out of that funding.
Okay. Thank you.
What is your interaction with the agencies that are now doing, I mean, I know that the recent budget with Governor Newsom is to suggest there's quite a bit more money for homelessness. And as we know, many of these victims of domestic violence are homeless. What is your interaction with those new dollars?
I do not believe that any of those, we have not heard if any of those dollars are coming to Cal OES to administer. We do have our Housing First program, which, but as far as the state dollars go, the only dollars we have right now for IVP is the 20 million.
So is there any way that there would be any coordination with those monies and what you do in terms of your victims? I mean, we've learned and we understand that those housing shelters need a few extra things. They need the security, they need to make sure that the families are safe. Is there any coordination, even if the monies aren't coming to you, is there coordination? Because clearly you have some expertise to explain that, you know, just opening up a random shelter and putting 25 people in there is not the answer. So, but is there any mechanism by which you coordinate so that some of these shelters might be a proper place for these victims?
We have not coordinated yet, but I would like, through my testimony, one of the things that the Victim Services Strategic Plan that we've worked very hard with CalVCB to partner and making sure that we are coordinating our services with compensation and then the direct services that we provide. One of the things that we've proposed is we are going to be developing a council with all of the state agencies that provide victim services, which there's quite a few of them, and we are going to get around a table and talk about what services everyone provides and how we can interlink and be more coordinated and be more partners in the field of victim services. So we are working on that this year, and we're hoping by in the fall we can coordinate that and have our first meeting. So that's one of that probably will be one of the agencies at the table to talk about how we can make sure we're coordinating those services. Because I believe most of the funds for homelessness has gone to HCD.
Can I just add on to that although we don't do a whole lot, the agencies themselves are very savvy, and most of them have connected with their homeless service providers and want to get in there because they acknowledge that lots of folks are homeless because of domestic violence, maybe from way back in their past. So they do a lot of coordination at the local levels. And California is a huge state, and we really rely a lot on these projects to know what is needed in their community.
I'm looking at the clock. We're supposed to break around 12, so I want to just bring that to people's attention. But I think the last point that you made with respect to your the community-based organizations that have taken the initiative to contact the Housing and Community Development, and no one can say that that isn't an admirable effort. But I think part of what we're looking for is a structure, so that there is some way to measure whether or not those efforts are successful, or in fact, that a requirement that more be done with respect to that coordination. So I think that's and you're nodding your heads yes. I'm not sure where the video camera is to pick that up, but I do want to
And
reflect.
I know
Yeah.
we, as you know, Cal OES is a coordinating agency, and we are doing this year, as I'm reading, nodding my head, is it's really important. Victim services is on everybody's top list as how we're serving it. The administration's interested in it. Of course, the legislature's interested in it. That's why we felt it was very important to take all of those agencies that are public health, Secretary of State, CDCR. I mean, I've listed most of them, a lot of them in here, that we can bring them to the table to say, what are you doing in victim services? This is what we're doing. How can we coordinate better and be better partners going forward? And that's what we're planning on doing this year.
Okay. I just want to suggest that if you have some particular points that you want to emphasize, that we do that. And commissioners, are you perched with questions here, or? Of course, of course.
So what's your relationship with the census that's going to take place this year? What we heard in meetings is that victims of domestic violence aren't going to show up on the census because they're hiding. And so the question becomes one of what are we doing as the state level to ensure that they are counted, right? Because it would help probably in federal funding, let alone other ways as well.
That is something I'd have to discuss with the executive staff at Cal OES. I do not have an answer for you on that currently. but I definitely will write that down.
Are there any other points in summation from our guests?
Do you have any other points?
Just two on processes, so you know we are definitely looking at how we can better serve our communities by putting our applications online to make it faster for them, because of course that's how the federal government is going, and we want to make sure as a state we're able to do that. Also on the processing of reimbursements to try to expedite it for all of our subrecipients in victim services. So those are two things that we are providing process improvements on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me echo what Commissioner Byer said with respect to his expression of appreciation for the responsibilities that you have and working with the various community-based organizations and trying to merge what's happening with the federal government. I can't even begin to imagine how complicated and difficult that must be. And I want to make sure that you understand that what we are doing here as a commission is sort of peeling the layers of the onion so that we can formulate recommendations that, quite frankly, you probably have thought of yourselves, all right? And you may be constrained just a little bit from expressing to us exactly what those are. But fortunately, we don't have an administration that purges employees who offer opinions that may be different from others. And so working with the staff, and I suppose I could tell you that we have in the past taken information from people anonymously if for some reason they think, and this is for anybody else out there, that is going to be of help in the work that we are doing. But again, thank you very much for the detailed work. We're going to get your attachments, and much appreciated.
Thank you, and if you have any further questions, please let us know, and we'll make sure that we get them to you.
Thank you. And before we get up and leave, we do have a member of the public who wants to offer public comment. So looking at the 3-minute suggestion, this might be an appropriate time to do it so they don't have to sit through the rest of the afternoon.
And, Mr. Chairman, that is Krista Nimzig from the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. Commissioners may remember that Krista testified at the October hearing and participated in the advisory committee meeting, but she's also asked to make public comment today. So,
welcome.
Good morning/afternoon, commissioners. I heard our organization's name invoked, so I thought I would come up for just a moment, not keep you all in suspense about some of the things we're thinking and working on. So a couple of pieces I wanted to touch on. I heard the question around the 14 mandated services within the state penal code and whether or not there are changes to be made there. At the partnership, we work closely with all of those domestic violence shelter-based organizations and the many other service providers that don't offer an emergency shelter. We have been engaging in conversations with the field for a couple of years now about what, if any, changes are needed to that structure to both maintain and support the shelter-based programs that are doing really critical, essential 24/7 work, make sure that they are solid and well-funded and, you know, that their services are not in any way jeopardized, and also create more stability and access for other types of programs. And at this point, we do not yet have recommendations to bring to the legislature because it is something that I think is a very complicated piece to try to do within the framework that exists while holding multiple things to be true. You all heard from our colleagues at Cal OES quite a bit of the complexity that exists around these programs and funding. And one piece that I just really want to emphasize is I know we've talked, or the Commission has talked quite a bit about the Domestic Violence Assistance Program because that is where the $20.6 million in state investment goes, and that the remaining competitive grants that Cal OES administers are not funded through state dollars, so it's a little less direct state control. But for the programs that operate, although those are all different grants, they come together to provide the holistic services. And so Cal OES, by managing all of those grants, holds in their heads all of the complexities of year +1, year +2, year +3, how do we keep everything stable? And so I just want to kind of name that in part through the strategic work that Cal OES has done in collaboration and partnership with the field, is they've been able to expand who's receiving funding by doing targeted competitive grants to fill key service needs that exist. And that's where you've heard the different numbers that they've shared of the 102 DVAP projects, but the larger number of nearly 200 grantees that they've brought in addition to that, to serve survivors in different ways. They're not serving survivors with state dollars because they're not receiving the DVAP funding, but they're able to serve survivors through all of these innovative and often transformative services. So I just wanted to kind of name that. Also wanted to just continue to lift up the conversation around the federal rules and the way that they play in, and even just to appreciate what Cal OES shared about the pros and cons of combining the state and federal dollars within the DVAP program. I will say I always learn something new when I hear from them, and today learned more about what separating them out could mean in terms of multiple applications, not being able to use state dollars as match for federal, all of which would be very challenging for the field. I think the last thing that service providers need is one more application or one fewer dollar source they can use as match. So I know that's been of real interest of how can we use dollars to be able to, provide some support for programs that are operating largely on a reimbursement basis because of federal rules. And so I appreciate that the commission is thinking creatively about that, and appreciate Cal OES providing that perspective. The other things I'll just mention before I let you all go to lunch, with apologies, is around the census, just to name, as that was the last question asked. We'll say we believe it's essential that survivors are counted and that there's a clear and holistic count of everyone here in California. And so we work closely with our national technical assistance providers, and in our role providing technical assistance or supporting the field and making sure that the shelter-based programs, victim service providers know how to ensure survivors are counted safely and confidentially. So that is a piece in progress, and I know the census is essentially important. And then we continue to engage around homelessness, and we'll continue those conversations about how to best address the many dollars that are being considered. As the commission knows, there's currently a hearing happening around homelessness concurrently right now, and so we are trying to be in two places at once and engage in those dialogues as well. So just wanted to name some of those pieces that came up this morning.
I just have one quick question from what you stated at the very beginning on the 14 criteria. Is it the fear of the community that if the rules were changed to say you have to do 10 of the 14, that you would lose most of your shelter base because that's more expensive?
I think that's absolutely a fear we hear, right? Shelter is incredibly expensive. The Domestic Violence Assistance Grant Program, and Cal OES can check my numbers, provides about $525,000 per grantee. And that is the combination of federal and state dollars, right? That's their total grant per year. To operate a 24/7 shelter and a 24/7 crisis hotline and provide counseling, right, is far more than that. So programs are using every penny that they receive plus more that they receive from other sources to be able to provide that shelter. And so yes, I think for shelter-based programs, there is a fear that that folks would stop providing shelter. And there's never been a moment, I don't believe, in our state's history, or at least in the 8 years that I've been with the statewide coalition, I'll only speak to my time, that shelters haven't been very much in need, right? That emergency shelter response hasn't been very much in need. And there's a lot of great work doing. You heard Cal OES speak about the Domestic Violence Housing First project they've been funding, which right now is helping survivors prevent their homelessness or get rapidly rehoused. And there's great transitional housing grants that they're providing. But emergency shelters remain full in many communities and remain an essential part of the safety net. So I think programs are worried, and so it's a both and of how do we make sure that doesn't happen, right, and that those programs are protected. And what's nice about the DVAP program is its stability, right? 3 to 5 year competitive grants are essential and important, and competitive is important. But it's hard to plan long term if you don't have stability. And so how do we create more stability for programs that don't operate a shelter but are still bedrock victim service programs? So that is the short answer of why we've been talking about it for several years and are not ready to talk to the legislature about it, because we need to continue to fine tune quite a bit of detail before that's.
Commissioner Byer has a question.
Yeah, thank you for your continued activism and what you do every day. Picking up on Senator Rubio's, I think, excellent point, there's so many good ideas that sometimes you have to attack things a little bit at a time. So I took the view that this activity belongs in the Surgeon General's office. But I also, in the deep, dark past, worked for Al Gore on reinventing government. And so I know from that political experience that the blood, sweat, tears, and political compromises necessary to change any government organization or its name is a big problem that you have to use a lot of resources to do. So I recognize that publicly, the service providers probably will say OES is great. So I'm not asking you to comment today, but I would ask you to survey your members informally and ask them to communicate with us. Because personally, I cannot understand how this field and those providers are going to be successful in the context of an agency where they're 1/1,000,000th of the budget of an agency. No matter how good the staff is and how knowledgeable they are, the degree of innovation, the degree of attention will always be dwarfed by larger other priorities. And so I understand the testimony that was heard, and I would expect that. But I would just challenge you to go to your members and say, is it worth it to move things? Because it may mean other changes on grants with audits as opposed to reimbursement schemes don't happen as quickly. And so I could be right about this in the long term, but you don't live in the long term. You live in the day-to-day, month-to-month. So we really want to do the right thing for victims by prioritizing things that matter the most to those people and abandon, my theoretical suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so we're going to room 125 for lunch, but it is a business meeting, and the public is welcome to attend. Thank you. And we are scheduled to return here at approximately 1:30.
All right, good afternoon. Chairman Nava had to leave early, so I'm taking over. And so I'll call our meeting back to order, and I apologize for the delay. Our business meeting ran a little long. So I will ask our executive director to call the first witness.
And the first witness is Stacy Alamo Mixon, who is the chief of the Safe and Active Communities branch at the California Department of Public Health, who is here to talk about preventing intimate partner violence and programs on prevention.
Great.
Ms. Mixon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting the California Department of Public Health to come speak to this issue. I know most of the information that you have been looking at are around providing survivor services, shelter-based services, and other survivor services. And obviously, we feel like those are incredibly important issues to make sure that survivors are safe and that they have the opportunities for healing. And I appreciate being able to come and talk to you about our programs. We tend to approach intimate partner violence from a primary prevention standpoint, which means we look to prevent the violence from ever happening in the first place. So it'll be a little bit different shift for us. I'm prepared to talk about why it's important to public health, what kind of approaches public health uses to address this issue, and also describe our programs in detail. And thank you for giving us the questions ahead of time, and I'm going to try to address those questions. And I'm assuming, I hope, that you've received our testimony already. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit. But
We did not actually receive,
okay.
unless I'm Crystal, am I wrong? We did not receive the written testimony, I'm afraid.
I'm hoping it's on its way,
Okay.
so you'll have it in written form. So I will just try to answer the questions as you posed them in an order that makes sense. So please feel free to ask for clarification or ask me any questions. So the first is, why is it important to public health? And this morning you had some very compelling testimony, especially from Senator Rubio, and she, I believe, quoted the 2015 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey that was conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that showed that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetimes. It's also found that more than half of female victims of rape reported being raped by an intimate partner. In California, it affects millions of people. According to another survey that's more recent, this was a survey from 2019. It was conducted by the Blue Shield Foundation of California. A full 58% of Californians say they have been personally touched by intimate partner violence, either as a survivor or as an abuser, or have had a friend or family member who has experienced intimate partner violence. It also found that 88% of Californians consider intimate partner violence to be a serious problem. So from a public health perspective, exposure to violence has a negative impact on many individual health outcomes. Witnessing or experiencing intimate partner violence can increase vulnerability and lead to negative health outcomes such as chronic disease, substance abuse, and infectious disease. For children, intimate partner violence in the family of origin, the loss of a parent, or incarceration of a parent are all specific measures of trauma exposure in adverse childhood experience surveys. The acute trauma and delayed stress experience worsens the health status of individuals and families and can extend across generations. Moreover, violence and the fear of violence may hinder access to basic human needs such as food, shelter, education, and employment. So as I mentioned, the California Department of Public Health approaches this issue as a public health issue, and rather than focusing on individuals and providing after-the-fact services to survivors, we apply a primary prevention approach that works to modify or eliminate the events, condition, or exposure to influences, otherwise known as risk factors, that result in the initiation of relationship violence and associated injuries, disabilities, and deaths. Primary prevention, as opposed to secondary or tertiary prevention, focuses on working upstream to address the underlying root causes to prevent violence from ever happening in the first place. So growing research has demonstrated that there are multiple strategies used to prevent intimate partner violence from happening in the first place. It includes a comprehensive approach that targets multiple risk and protective factors as early in life as possible. It's very critical to broadening and sustaining the impact on intimate partner violence. Strategies should focus on recognizing that adolescence is a critical development period for prevention of IPV. And for example, relationship violence in adolescence can be a precursor or a risk factor for this type of violence in adulthood. So primary prevention of IPV means addressing teen dating violence as early as possible. And examples of specific activities that constitute primary prevention: working with children, youth, parents, and caregivers to set expectations for healthy relationships, engaging youth leaders to work with schools, workplaces, and other community settings to change policy and social norms, mobilizing the community to promote healthy relationships and positive bystander behaviors, and working with young men to promote healthy masculinity. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of example of how we approach this. I want to jump to talking specifically about the programs that we administer. So for the past 25 years, CDPH's Injury and Violence Prevention Branch has funded local rape crisis centers and domestic violence organizations. We've provided them with training and technical assistance, and we've disseminated best practices to prevent both intimate partner violence and sexual violence. In 1995, CDPH began administering funds from the Domestic Violence Training and Education Fund. This fund was established by statute and is included in penal code. It collects fees from convicted batterers and is allocated to CDPH on an annual basis. This pot of money also goes to support local programs, and a portion of it also goes to the Department of Justice to support a registry program. For this current fiscal year, CDPH received $617,000 from the Domestic Violence Training and Education Fund, and that's being used to fund 2 local DV organizations. The organizations are Tahoe Safe Alliance in Placer County and the Family Violence Law Center in Alameda County. Both organizations are funded to implement a program called Close to Home. And Close to Home is an evidence-informed program that engages community members to design solutions and lead social change for domestic violence, teen dating violence, and sexual violence prevention. The projects focus on youth leaders to mobilize their communities by creating dialogue and action to promote healthy relationships. The Domestic Violence Training and Education Fund also supports specialized training and technical assistance to assist all local DV organizations to apply primary prevention approaches. Another program that we administer that is not directly funding for the purposes of intimate partner violence, but we leverage to fund those kind of activities, is our rape prevention and education program. So the department receives $4.2 million in funding annually from the CDC to administer this program. We use it to fund 4.2 million annually, and it's in 5-year cycles. We fund 24 local rape crisis centers to implement and evaluate primary prevention programs that prevent first-time perpetration and victimization of sexual violence. And with similar risk factors, target populations, especially youth, and evidence-based programs, the efforts of the RPE program are leveraged to impact intimate partner violence as well. We also receive about $125,000 annually from Cal OES through an interagency agreement, and we use this to provide technical assistance to Cal OES's funded teen dating violence prevention programs on the prevention programs that they administer. We also assist Cal OES with new program development for both domestic violence and sexual violence programs, and we coordinate a state-level collaborative between CDPH, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, and the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault to address intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and teen dating violence. And I believe in their testimony this morning, Cal OES referred to the state-level collaborative, which is referred to as the California State-Level Collaborative for Domestic Violence, Sexual Violence, and Teen Dating Violence Prevention. So that collaborative began voluntarily convening in 2016, and it now meets informally on a quarterly basis here in Sacramento. The collaboration intentionally aligns the 4 agencies using shared definitions of prevention and builds on individual agency mandates, strengths, and resources. As part of this collaborative, CDPH shares research methodologies, data, evaluation tools, strategies, and promising practices from the field to inform local and state-level efforts for primary prevention. Let's see. I think there was a question that the Commission asked about addressing children who have witnessed intimate partner violence. So I just wanted to mention there that we absolutely agree that the provision of victim services provides a critical opportunity to intervene with children to address the trauma of exposure. And again, it represents one of the many recognized adverse childhood experiences, and it would also interrupt the intergenerational cycle of violence by intervening. And although it's clear that we have specific definitions for prevention and intervention in this field, it's also clear that prevention and intervention are also not separate entities, and that people's experiences do not exist in one column or the other. Many people, in fact, have been exposed to some type of violence or abuse in their lives, so prevention programs are considered in this context. And I just want to say all of the primary prevention programs that we administer, all of the local folks that go out and talk to young people, there very often are disclosures during those primary prevention interventions, and we ensure that the folks that are giving these programs are prepared to address those situations and make sure there's a warm handoff to any services that those folks would provide. It's not possible to address the prevention with individuals without acknowledging and providing resources to survivors. And it's important to link community awareness and mobilization work to intimate partner violence with community-based services. One of the findings of our Close to Home community mobilization program was that local organizations working on preventing intimate partner violence were only able to gain their community's buy-in when they gained community trust and were able to respond to their community's needs with the necessary resources. And this is why funding, I think, rape crisis centers and local domestic violence organizations to do primary prevention is perfect, because they are the organizations that can do primary prevention and give services to survivors if needed.
Can I ask a quick question about these services and the services in centers? Is there too much stigma and difficulty to try to make it more broad and make it something that you would have information in schools? So to anybody, and then and similar to other programs that we have in elementary schools, is that something that would be too difficult, or just too much stigma for some poor child then to, oh, that's my family? Has that been addressed, thought of, discounted? Just curious.
So I think there's many opportunities to do public information and awareness around intimate partner violence. Most of our programs are really targeted. So when we choose domestic violence organizations or rape crisis centers to do this work, they have to demonstrate to us that they're very excited about this. They're willing, they have the capacity, they have the relationships with schools and community members to be able to go out and do these programs. Many of them are school-based programs. Coaching boys into men happens in schools. The Close to Home projects, they work in schools and in communities as well. Am I addressing your question?
I think you are. So what you're saying is, because what I was hearing you say is someone's identified as a victim, and then they get the services. And I'm looking at, because we're trying to address somebody before that. So is there a way to educate to pre-identify? Or identify at an earlier stage, so then those kids go into these other programs which are more intense and have more skills, but you do something at sort of more broad, generic level in the schools, so that some child might say, that might be me. Maybe I should go and talk to somebody. So I guess I'm thinking one step back and a little more broad, where you're still in the schools in early prevention to kids, but those children have been sort of identified. And I'm looking to, is there a path to identify maybe more?
So the interventions that we promote are to general populations within the school. So they don't go in and they don't specifically target at-risk individuals. They're going in and talking to youth in general in schools, do youth empowerment, so it's everyone. It is primary prevention, yeah. It's not meant to be a screening program to screen out. So if we are providing a program to classrooms or to doing some youth engagement activities, all I'm saying is if those youth recognize what's going on and they disclose, then those folks are trained then to say, this is where I can refer you to follow up for services. We always want to make sure that everything we do, if it's primary, secondary, or tertiary, is trauma informed. So we know when we're addressing anyone of the public, especially youth, that there is a possibility that they have experienced violence in their lives already.
Okay. So I understand what you're saying. I guess I was somewhat triggered by you saying that you give to providers who have these skills. And so I was immediately thinking, well, you're dealing with already the population that's identified, but you're just saying that it's groups that would then know once somebody is identified what to do, but they're just going out for broad education.
Yes.
So got it.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Good point.
Okay.
So just a follow-up on that. So using like the teen dating violence prevention as an example, so you go into high schools or middle schools, how prevalent is that in schools? How is this something that has not really been fully implemented, or is this something that's widespread in all middle schools and high schools in California?
I think it just depends, and unfortunately I don't have any statistics with me right now on how prevalent teen dating violence is in schools, but suffice it to say that it is problematic.
Well, I was more asking the question of getting in front of those kids and teaching them proper conduct with each other. How is this a widespread program, or is this something that really hasn't been fully implemented throughout the state?
How many kids are basis?
I can't answer that. We've got two domestic violence organizations that are doing close to home. We have 8 rape crisis centers that are also implementing the close to home project. The rest of the rape crisis centers are doing in-school programs. I can get that information. It's kind of difficult when they report. That's kind of the data that we try to capture about how many children they have had in those programs. They also evaluate the programs, and they send us evaluation on an annual basis because they do pre and post tests very often with the young people that they're dealing with. They also measure, have there been changes in school policies as a result of the work that has been done?
I think what Sean's asking for and data
proportion,
when you have a chance is, for all the groups that you fund, how many school districts are they hitting? And then, are they in every school district but not at every school?
Yeah.
I think to find out head counts is going to be crazy. We don't do sign-ins, like things like that. But how many are they partnered with a lot of school districts? Is that something that, and then statistics of how, I'm sure it's a successful program because it's early intervention, and that's where you have to start the cycle, stop the cycle as at early intervention. So I think we'd all be very interested in knowing, how far-reaching is your program? Is it just, the Riverside school district, or is it?
We've got 2 Riverside teens here.
Yeah.
I can get you more information on exactly which entities that we fund. So there's 27 entities across the state. Now keep in mind that if a rape crisis center is doing this program, their reach may be a little limited. What we ask them to do is to go into their schools that they have good relationships with, that they think the students are maybe at higher risk. So they don't have the ability to do district-wide. Typically, they may have 1 or 2 schools that they get in. It can be very difficult to bring a program, to bring a program into a school and fully implement it. So we ask them to kind of go for the low-hanging fruit, get into those schools and do the best you can with them. But this isn't something that within a county, one rape crisis center gets and they're able to address all schools within that county. Yeah, the scope is a little limited in that way. But I'd be happy to get you information on the agencies that we do fund, what counties they're in, and any other information we have from our evaluations that you might.
That'd be great. Data helps us, and it helps us make the recommendations to the legislature. So, it just, even if you're only in 25 schools, it's still important for us to know that. So,
Mr. Chairman or somebody? So there are other means of getting into schools, though, right? I mean, so I come from a school district that for years has had what we call social living classes that are required for kids, right? And in Berkeley, they actually do it twice for a child, once in junior high and once in high school. Do you all work with school districts regarding curriculum around domestic violence and teen violence and all of that, so that you give them curriculums so that they can do them internally? They don't even need to depend on, let's say, the rape crisis center in the area or whatever.
Right. So we don't do that in general, but I can say that every time the Department of Education does their health education standards, we provide input into that. And this last time around, I believe we gave them significant input around sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and teen dating violence to make sure that it was in their curriculum framework, which, as you know, the Department of Education produces things like that in hopes that the schools pick them up. So we gave input into that, and we gave a lot of resources that we recommended that the school districts avail themselves, that we felt like were the newest and the most evidence-informed kind of strategies. So that's how we've been able to kind of impact what the schools do.
I'm sorry, we stopped you. If you have more.
Well, there was one other, you had talked a little bit about wanting to know about data. So we do look at kind of typical data using vital statistics. So we have the ability to look at emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and deaths through our vital statistics data. So we do take a look at that. The shortcoming of that, obviously, is that our program isn't scaled up statewide, and then what we do to change social norms and some of the activities we do take years. to actually make a significant difference. My sister branch is the tobacco control branch, and how many years has it taken for them to change social norms and attitudes such that smoking rates have gone down? So it takes a very long time and a very serious investment to do that. So I wanted to talk about that. But I also wanted to let you know that we have what is called the California Violent Death Reporting System. We call it CalVDRS. Now, this is another example of how we learn more about how violence happens and what contributes to that. So we are funded to do this through the CDC, and we actually use a CDC system to enter data from coroners and medical examiners. Now, keep in mind, these are only deaths, but it captures deaths as a result of intimate partner violence, which is why I thought you might be interested. So it can obtain critical information on the circumstances surrounding these deaths. For example, the perpetrator-victim relationship, any mental health status at the time of death, familial stressors, and toxicology reports. So it's a web-based surveillance system that links vital statistics from medical examiners and coroners. So those are investigative reports, toxicology, medical history. It also links reports from law enforcement. That includes the use of weapons and circumstances of the incident. We've had funding from CDC for quite some time to implement a pilot project, but now we're fully funded and we're expanding the collection of information across California. There are currently 20 local jurisdictions involved, representing 55% of the violent deaths for 2018. We're going to continue expanding this program. And as the data becomes available, the idea is it will be shared with local jurisdictions and translated into actionable information to be used by state and local partners to better understand and address violent death, including the deaths associated with intimate partner violence. So I thought you'd be interested in that. Again, it's looking at what goes into intimate partner violence from the very beginning, and will give us very rich information that we can start targeting efforts toward, or at least make known to local organizations. I also wanted to say that we have a violence prevention intervention or initiative in the department that we recently embarked on, and it's really looking at all forms of violence in the department. We engage our Fusion Center, our Center for Family Health, and many other programs in the department to elevate violence prevention from a public health perspective. We, and I'll leave one of these with Crystal, but one of the first things we did was put together a document called Preventing Violence in California, the Role of Public Health. And I'll leave this with you because it explains in a lot more detail what goes into it, what are surveillance activities, what are our epidemiology kinds of activities, and what programs we consider to be evidence-informed to apply to intimate partner violence as well as other types of violence. They share a lot of risk and protective factors. So I will leave that with Crystal.
I have one last question I'm going to ask on behalf of my commissioner, David Byer. I don't know that he would ask this question, but I'm going to guess he would ask this question. Okay. And that is, what would your opinion be if we recommended we move what's going on now at OSE to you?
I am not prepared to give an opinion on that. There's a whole lot of considerations, obviously, that would go into moving money from one organization to the other. They are our sister state agency. I would need to get much more information about what they administer, what the challenges are. And I suspect some of the challenges that they have, being a sister state agency, we may also have those same challenges. So a lot more information would need to go into
So
that.
it could be moving deck chairs on the Titanic versus solving a problem. It could be. You don't know.
That is a possibility, and
Understood.
I'm not prepared to look at that in detail.
Okay. Well, in his absence, I thought I'd throw out the question because that's something he would ask.
I watched the testimony this morning, so I think you're probably spot on with that question.
Do we have any other questions? From
The collaborative, you talked about DPH and OES. Who are the other two agencies that are?
The California Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. So those are the two state non-governmental agencies, and they serve as the advocates for all of the local agencies in domestic violence and sexual violence.
Thank you.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, our next witness, I think there was a break on the agenda, but we will just skip that break. And the next topic is economic security among survivors, a key issue for survivors of domestic violence. And Amy Durrence, who's the Director of Law and Policy at FreeFrom, which is a advocacy organization that studies economic insecurity and IPV issues, is here to summarize her testimony. Her written testimony is on page 11 of your packet, but she will summarize her testimony and then answer questions.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Amy Durrence, the Director of Law and Policy for FreeFrom. Thank you so much for inviting us to come and testify here today. We're very excited for the opportunity. I should say that our founder and CEO, Sonia Posse, sends her regrets for not being able to join me, but she is down with the flu. Yes, so I will try to do my best to represent our organization in her absence. And today I'm going to really be talking about that critical nexus between intimate partner violence and financial insecurity. Then I'm also going to go into the current gaps in the services that are being provided to survivors of intimate partner violence, then talk about how we can really take a holistic approach in filling those gaps. And then we've got some recommendations for the commission that I'll go into in some more detail. So I'll start by sort of talking about our organization. FreeFrom is a national organization based in Los Angeles, and we are working to dismantle that critical nexus between intimate partner violence and financial insecurity, and we're doing so by creating pathways to financial security and long-term safety for survivors. So what am I really talking about when I'm talking about this critical nexus? Well, when I talk about our work, I really like to start by talking about the problem that we're trying to solve for, okay? And that is that the number one reason that survivors stay in or return to an abusive situation is because they can't afford to leave or stay safe. And I just think that is such almost like a mind-blowing and important reality that I like to repeat it whenever I talk about this issue. So the number one reason that survivors stay in or return to abuse is because they simply cannot afford to leave or stay safe. And so why is that the case? Why is safety not an affordable option for so many survivors? Well, the first piece of that puzzle is that the experience of violence is incredibly expensive. So in 2018, the CDC published a report that estimated that the average cost lifetime cost per female survivor in the United States is just under $104,000. That is a staggering amount. And this looks like medical bills, therapy expenses, damaged property, and relocation costs. The issue is this number doesn't even tell the whole story, because in 99% of intimate partner violence cases, the survivor is also experiencing economic abuse. And economic abuse occurs when a harm doer controls a survivor's financial resources and their ability to acquire and use those financial resources. So this could look like prohibiting a survivor from going to work or going to school. We've heard about harm doers hiding car keys, for example, or slashing tires. It also looks like harm doers monitoring survivors' online bank accounts so that they're unable to save in order to have enough money to leave. And increasingly, we're seeing that harm doers are applying for credit cards in a survivor's name, then incurring a lot of debt. And so, not only are you seeing the actual costs, but you're seeing the economic impact of this economic abuse. And it's not enough to just talk about the high cost of the experience of violence, but you also have to ask who's paying those costs. And unfortunately, it's survivors. Survivors are essentially having to foot the bill for the abuse that they're enduring. And so this means that when a survivor goes to leave, they're doing so with 6 figures in costs, damaged credit, no support system, no money, no assets, usually no income, no job, no way to make an income. And so when we really think through these two pieces, right, it should be no surprise that the number one reason that survivors are returning is because they can't afford to leave or stay safe. And another important issue that is the result of this economic abuse piece is that the activity of economic abuse erodes a survivor's financial autonomy. And what I mean when I say financial autonomy is really a person's ability and confidence to make their own financial decisions and have control over their own money and assets. Okay, so you can also understand how that is a debilitating factor for survivors to have to overcome once they are free from that abuse. And we know that these issues are directly impacting Californians. And we know this based on some preliminary data that we're getting out of an ongoing study by FreeFrom, Citibank, and the LA Housing and Community Investment Department, and as well as Cal State Long Beach. And so in this ongoing study, we have been surveying survivors as well as service providers in the LA area. And this preliminary data shows that 100% of the surveyed survivors reported experiencing some type of economic abuse. And so that looks like 98% experiencing economic restriction. So that means, for example, a harm doer keeping financial information from a survivor. 96% experiencing economic exploitation. And so that's like what the example I use for harm doers taking out credit cards and running up debt in a survivor's name. And then 98% experienced educational or employment sabotage. And so we're seeing the economic abuse for survivors in California, but also the impact of that economic abuse and the other costs of intimate partner violence. Because in the survivors that we've surveyed, only 43% reported having a personal checking account, and only 24% had a personal savings account. And the average checking account balance was $194. And the average savings account amount was $310. And then 35% reported having credit card debt, and 28% reported loan debt, with an average credit score of 578, which is a very poor score. So we can understand, looking at this picture, why it is that survivors return, because they simply can't afford to stay gone, especially if they have children that they have to take care of. And so what survivors really need in order to not have to go back, in order to achieve that long-term safety, is they need support on the road down financial recovery. And they need support in achieving sustainable financial security. And unfortunately, currently, they're not getting that support in the traditional resources that are available to them. And so what do I mean by that? That is that the current California response, and I should know, it's not just California with this problem. This is a problem with the response to intimate partner violence across the United States. And that is that the current resources and the traditional resources are crisis focused. So what does that mean? We're talking about temporary restraining orders and shelters and the services that are provided at shelters. And I should say right now, this crisis intervention work is incredibly necessary, totally essential, life-saving work. It has to continue, right? But just because something is necessary does not mean that it's sufficient. And when we are, well, I should say the first piece is we know that it's an insufficient response because it's only going to meet a fraction of the need, right? So there are nearly 5 million women living in Los Angeles County, and we've heard the 1 in 3 prevalent statistic, right? There's 2,000 shelter beds available for survivors of domestic violence in Los Angeles County. So that's obviously insufficient. Additionally, these are short-term solutions. So we're seeing, you get a survivor out of immediate danger, you get a survivor emergency housing, but what happens when that emergency housing ends? What happens when those housing vouchers end? What happens when the public assistance ends? Survivors are not getting the resources and support to think about what's next. And we know this is happening in California, similarly from this ongoing study. So we asked our survivors that we were surveying how often their case managers had assisted them with managing money, debt, credit, or finding employment over the prior 3 months, and 88% said that they'd received help 0 times. And this,
can I stop you there?
Sure.
You mentioned case manager. Where's their case? Where's their case manager coming from?
This is within shelters.
So it's within the shelter. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So they didn't get this support, even though the majority said that they were not confident at all about managing their debt, or only slightly confident about managing their credit. And if you recall, talking about eroding someone's financial autonomy, eroding that individual's confidence to really have the ability to take care of their finances, you can see this playing out in this data, right? And then we also asked service providers that same question. How often have you assisted your clients with managing their money, debt, credit, or finding a job during the previous 3 months? And the most common response was 0 times. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question.
Sure.
first let me say the data is extraordinarily sobering, scary, but also helpful. And so I'm wondering if there's any data of if survivors are given some support, how many times then are they successful in getting out of the cycle? And then if that number is like this actually is a path, are there micro banks? Are there things that we could do or recommend that would help to finance these particular victims who have demonstrated that they're victims from some way or another, in order to get a loan at a low interest or a grant or a credit rating to get them to get out of the cycle?
Sure. So I guess my response to that first piece is that we know that in a few different studies, up to like 73% of survivors have said that the reason that they've stayed is for financial concerns. So that gives you an idea. If we are able to get folks to a position where they are financially secure, where they do have that financial autonomy rebuilt or repaired, that's a large percentage of survivors that would not go back, presumably, right? So we're looking at a really big change if we can help survivors achieve that long-term sustainable safety through financial security. As far as how can we really help survivors get there, like what can we do? I'm very glad that you asked, and I am definitely going to talk about that in more detail. Well, you know what? Let's just go for it now. Okay, so sure.
So we sometimes hear about the 14 services
Sure.
that are provided, to get some funding. Is the service that you're talking about one of those 14?
So to be completely honest, I'm not plugged into the 14 services. We know that from our work with survivors and with our work with service providers that what we consider to be the work that is necessary to get to that financial security isn't being done, and I can talk a little bit more about that. So we
suggest it's not one of the 14 then, right?
I don't think it is.
Okay.
And one of our
because otherwise it'd be happening more than
that's right
0%.
And I think spoiler alert, one of our recommendations is that we need to start implementing these holistic financial security programs within organizations. And I'm sorry, I was answering somebody's question. Oh, sure. So I should say that, it's not that survivors are not receiving any kind of financial support. It's just that it's short-term financial support. So getting connected with public assistance, for example. But it's what happens.
But why is that short? That's not short-term.
Well, it's
at least 4 years.
Well, it's unsustainable. Right?
You mean it's not enough money?
What I mean is that in order for survivors to be able to leave and stake on,
right,
to be financially secure, we need to help them build up their capacity to be financially secure on their own. And and I'm not saying this is a yes and, this is not a but. So certainly public assistance is necessary, is essential, and we need to help survivors be able to thrive after public assistance.
So you're talking about financial literacy from the perspective of once they are on their own, they understand that they've been sheltered from or they've been prevented from managing their own finances. They need training.
Sure. They need help. They need education in how to make income, right? And how to start saving and how to deal with debt and credit issues. And they're not getting that support right now in the shelters. They're getting shorter-term financial help.
I understand. I'm just trying to figure out what the role is of TANF dollars, okay, or CalWORKs, whatever you want to call it, right? Because originally, when we wrote the legislation, it focused on victims of domestic violence, right? That they, first of all, they could be exempted from certain requirements, why they were doing certain things, right, just to get themselves free, whatever, okay? But then also that the services would be provided to them, whether or not the Department of Social Services was paying for it or they were getting somebody else to pay for it. But it does give a family, right? I mean, right, an individual woman, that's a whole other issue. But for a family, it does give them subsistence at least, plus Medi-Cal and food stamps, right? That also says that they have some place to live, that kind of thing. And so I'm just trying to figure out that to me, it's a basis, right, from which to operate from at least as people are moving along. It's not enough money, I get that, okay?
Sure.
But at least it's a basis if everybody was coming in, right, and every county realized its obligations in regards to providing services to victims of domestic violence. And I understand that every county doesn't understand that. but it would just seem to me that it was in the original statute to do that, if we could make a demand on them.
And again, I would say that what we're discussing here, what I'm talking about here and testifying about here is not no more public assistance. It's a yes and, right? So it's not enough for us to give folks, and it's very essential and important, but to give them that money and then say, and that's essentially it.
Absolutely.
So
I'm sorry to interrupt. Have you thought about going outside of the system of Cal OES or the system of where these funds come from in order to fund financial literacy, like through in California, the California Department of Education? It has a financial literacy program, and it has various, it can refer you to websites and things, but they do have a financial literacy program. Have you thought about speaking to an organization like that that's outside of that realm that may be able to provide some expertise?
well, I think that our approach to creating these pathways to financial security and long-term safety for survivors is a holistic one, right? We want to look at the whole system and start thinking about solutions for the whole system. And that really starts with supporting people working in the movement already, right? So we know that many folks that are advocates within the movement are themselves survivors. And so, we've talked about how there is a gap in this long-term financial security work being done right now. And so we ask the question, why? Why is that happening? Why is there this gap? And one piece is funding restrictions. Shelters and other service provider organizations are required to implement certain programs based on their funding. And so we've worked with survivors who, for example, were one survivor who was essentially encouraged to turn down a living wage job to do welfare to work program because the shelter had to have that in place based on their funding. So one piece is to give shelters a little less restrictive funding, allow them some more flexibility in their funding. In fact, that's really the reason that FreeFrom has had the success that we've been able to have, is because we have general operating support. So, we, for example, you've read about our Survivor Wealth and Wellness Training Program in the written testimony. That started off as an entrepreneurship program for survivors, like essentially an incubator. So we actually had individual survivors that we helped. They came in with a business idea and the skills that they needed to effectuate that idea, but they needed support in branding, logos, business plan, those sorts of things. And it was very successful. 100% of those businesses are still in operation now. 100% of those businesses turned a profit within the first month. But we very quickly realized, at that point, I think we were a staff of only like 5. And there are all these people on our waiting list. Well, our impact is limited. So how can we then go and scale our impact and increase our impact? And we were able to pivot and take that Survivor Wealth, our entrepreneurship program, and turn it into this e-learning course, the Survivor Wealth and Wellness Training, with some other things involved in that too that I can get into. But we were able to do that pivot, provide that e-learning course to other organizations so that they could then do that same work with their clients. So we already have some success on that front. An organization that we trained in Houston has already implemented an entrepreneurship program within their organization, and they've helped 14 survivors start businesses of their own. So we were only able to make that pivot because we have general operating support. So we were able to see, okay, we have this idea, we have this program, it's working, but it could be working better. How can we change it to make it work better? And if we had more restrictions on that funding, we wouldn't have been able to have the flexibility to do so. So that's one piece. Another piece of why this work isn't being currently done in shelters is going back to when I mentioned that a lot of folks working in the movement are survivors themselves. They have the same financial insecurity issues as those people that they're helping, and they're being essentially underpaid and overworked. We've talked to folks working in the movement who said, look, how can I help a survivor that I'm working with check their credit score when I've never checked my own credit score? I've got anxiety about looking at my credit score. I don't want to know what it says, or I wouldn't know how to start repairing my credit even if I saw it. And so really what that said to us is, wait a second, in order for us to really increase capacity in the movement, we've got to start with the people working in the movement. We've got to increase their capacity. We've got to make sure they feel financially secure. We need folks that are working in the movement to feel as comfortable helping the survivors that they serve, reach this financial security as they already do in helping them get a TRO, helping them sign up for public assistance, helping them get a housing voucher. And, we know that this need for this type of holistic work is there. An example is that some of our partners that we work with on the Survivor Wealth and Wellness training have come to us because, they have, like, for example, housing vouchers. So they'll be able to give survivors that they serve housing vouchers. But they're seeing over and over again that once that housing voucher is run out, the same folks are coming right back. And the reason is they're not getting support in, okay, when you leave, how can you continue to thrive without having to keep coming back? We know that survivors return an average of 7 times. So if we can get survivors, if we can build up their financial autonomy, their financial security to a place where they can thrive on their own, then they won't keep coming back. And then we can really make some good headway and starting to, work towards ending the cycle of violence in California and beyond. And so I guess I would really like to talk to you about, just as an example of how we know that this approach will work or can work. And our Survivor Wealth and Wellness training is an example of a holistic financial security sort of program and training that we believe, if implemented widely, really will go a long way in stopping the cycle of violence. And you see in the written testimony, a couple of our wins. I've already talked about the entrepreneurship program started at one of our partner organizations. At that same organization, the executive director, after taking our training, was like, oh, wow, I have got to support my staff in becoming more financially secure. Gosh, we're trying to do this work. We're tasking these folks with doing this work with survivors, but they're not feeling that security themselves. And so she went to her board and was able to raise everybody's salaries by $5,000. And so that's a structural organizational change that you see in this kind of holistic approach, right? And then I've already mentioned the 14 survivors and the entrepreneurship program at that organization. But then also another organization, they essentially, after taking the training, saw that they weren't doing enough work with their survivors on building this sort of holistic financial security. And for example, they weren't asking, and we see this a lot when we talk to survivors who are receiving more traditional resources. They don't get asked, what are you good at? What's your talent? Like, how can we take that and help you turn that into some income so that you can become financially secure? So they added that question to their intakes, like, what's your previous employment? What skills do you have? And how can we think creatively with you about those skills to turn that into income and to really help you get to a place where you've got that financial autonomy? And so these are some small wins, but it shows that these are the kinds of programs that can really have, a long-term impact on getting us closer to ending the cycle of violence. And it's in California and really, truly beyond. And so if there aren't any questions about any of that, I can go into some of our recommendations. Okay. So I've already talked a little bit about funding innovation. I've been talking about it in terms of funding, giving general operating support. And again, I've given some examples from FreeFrom. I'll give another example though. I should just say, let me take a step back and say that currently with restrictive funding, service providers are left to essentially be putting out fires all the time. How many beds do we have? What's going on with public assistance, right now, and they're not really given the space to think about, well, what's next? And how can we creatively approach this problem? And again, just to use FreeFrom as an example, we started in early days having conversations with individual survivors over the phone about avenues to compensation, legal avenues to compensation that are already available. So when I'm saying that, I'm talking about Cal VCB in California, small claims court, criminal restitution, and civil tort claims. So how can survivors try to recoup some of those costs, that $104,000 amount that I referred to earlier? And we were literally getting on the phone with one survivor at a time and saying, here are your options, let's send you to some resources. And again, it was one of those moments of, wow, our impact is really limited here. We're spending hours on the phone and we're telling one survivor at a time about this really critical information. What if we we're able to use technology to do this. Not only would we be able to reach more people faster, but we'd also be able to reach traditionally under-resourced folks. So folks who live in rural areas, folks who don't have access to regular transportation or childcare, people who are still in the situation and haven't left yet, because that's an important population that doesn't, often get resources if they haven't been able to leave. And so we turn that into our compensation compass, and we're going to leave a packet with Crystal here that includes a note card and a QR code. You can just scan it and play around with the compensation compass. But essentially, in just a matter of minutes, we're doing exactly what it took us hours and hours and hours to do with one survivor at a time. And we were only able to do that pivot and take a foray into technical resources for survivors because we had the flexibility of general operating support. And then our next recommendation is to fund financial security programs. And I mean, that's really what I've been talking about for the bulk of this testimony, right? Is that we have to be doing work with survivors that is thinking about what's next for them. So short term is essential. It's necessary. It's just not sufficient. So we need to take that next step and provide that holistic support to survivors so that when they're out of that temporary support, they can still thrive without having to come back and get more support. And really, a part of that funding financial security programs is supporting the folks that are working in the movement. And I know I've already spoken to that a little bit, but it's really important that if we're really going to be able to integrate these kind of financial services that are necessary for survivors to achieve long-term safety, we've got to start with the folks in the movement. We've got to make sure that they have that confidence and they have that ability, and then they can really increase their capacity to then do that work with their survivor clients. And, I've talked a lot about the survivor wealth and wellness training, but any training, we're the recommendation is to provide funding to train folks with our training, but really that's just an example of the type of holistic approach that really is necessary. And that also goes to supporting folks in the movement, paying them a living wage, making sure that they're financially secure. The next recommendation, and this is one that I personally feel pretty passionately about, because before coming to FreeFrom, I was a civil litigator for a number of years in Atlanta. And as it stands right now, attorneys or folks that are essentially like pro bono legal help for survivors are unable to represent survivors and bringing civil tort claims against their harm doers because of restrictions under the Legal Services Corporation funding. There's restrictions that essentially attorneys are not allowed to bring those claims using that money. So pro bono, there's hardly any pro bono, there is no pro bono representation essentially of survivors bringing those tort claims against their harm doers. And this,
what is the logic behind that? I mean,
I think that it's like something it's been in place a long time.
Feds don't want to use their federal dollars to sue the federal government.
Well, and it has to do with
I mean, if I'm suing the spouse, then I'm not suing the federal government. I'm suing the guy who.
Well, and I think sorry, Deb, but
no, I'm just trying to think it through.
I think that also there are some issues of folks who are doing pro bono legal work shouldn't take on cases that will essentially yield a money judgment, right? So like taking on profitable cases almost, I suppose.
But the money then should go all to the victim. They can't
right.
do it on a
right.
on a contingency basis and then profit from it. I get that.
Right,
but
right. Well, but the issue is because of those funding restrictions, so the reason that I'm passionate about it as a previous civil litigator is that the entire reason that we have tort law in the United States is so, if someone harms me, I don't have to pay for that harm. Well, that's exactly what's happening to survivors under our current legal framework. They are left to foot the bills of their own abuse. So,
a California.
Well, in federal
restriction, or is it
federal?
Too?
So what our sort of recommendation is to make some changes there to open up this avenue, because really, truly, that is the essence of tort law. And so to not only open up funding here in California, but also advocate at the federal level to remove those restrictions. And then, of course, I've already mentioned supporting survivor service providers. That's a really big deal, and it's very important if we're really going to have holistic change. Also, removing some structural barriers to survivor wealth. And what this is really describing is policy change. So we've got some recommendations for policy changes. First is expand the legal definition of intimate partner violence or domestic violence to include economic abuse. So we've talked a little bit about economic abuse, what it is, and how incredibly prevalent it is. And not only the prevalence, but the devastating impact that it can have on a survivor long after a survivor is able to leave, which looks like damaged credit, which looks like that loss of financial autonomy. And so we cannot really solve a problem if we're not properly defining it. And so we are advocating, not just in California, but across the country, to expand the definition of intimate partner violence to include economic abuse. Also to establish paid and protected leave for survivors to be able to miss work to deal with the consequences of abuse. And California has one of the better paid leave statute or leave statutes for survivors. It's not perfect. Currently survivors still have to use accrued sick or vacation time. And so we don't, they're not sick, they're not on vacation, they're dealing with the consequences of abuse.
So let me ask you from a practical perspective, your recommendation is having 10 extra paid leave days for victims. What about, is there a barrier there because the victims don't want to go to their employer and tell them that they're a victim?
That's a great question. We haven't really seen, so I should say, and it's in the written testimony, but New Zealand recently passed this law across the country so that everybody has 10 days of paid and protected leave available to them. While that seems, it is intuitively a concern, I think in practice it hasn't really played out that way. That folks, if you need the days, then you'll take the days.
It seems like, this could be, it's a federal issue, but you could expand FMLA, family
Sure.
medical leave, and you could put it in there that someone could then tap into their FMLA benefits without sort of just carrying this 10 days. But that's a federal matter. But
Well, and it's just important, I suppose, I could break it down into the components of what we think are essential to really give survivors the support they need when it comes to paid leave, and that's additional days in addition to their accrued sick and vacation time, paid, meaning that, because we're this whole testimony is based on, or is discussing financial insecurity. A lot of survivors can't afford to miss work if it means that they're going to miss that paycheck, and definitely can't afford to miss work if it means that their job might not be waiting for them when they come back.
That'd be an amendment to the Paid Family Leave Act here. Okay.
And we're actually working, FreeFrom is starting a partnership. We're working out the details, but with an employer to pilot exactly the policy that we are suggesting. So to be able to show after a pilot period of 12 months, look, this works. Businesses don't have to shutter their doors. And in fact, there's some benefit for the business, right? You're creating less turnover, really increasing employee loyalty to the employer and those types of things. And then we're also suggesting, as far as policy change goes, an increase in access to civil justice and remedies for survivors. And so that looks like in California, increasing the statute of limitations that applies to the designated domestic violence tort. So currently, the domestic violence tort in California is good in a lot of ways. So for example, it's a continuing tort, meaning that a survivor can, the statute of limitations doesn't start to run until the last incident of domestic violence, and then that's when the statute of limitations starts to run, and the survivor can then essentially sue for all of the domestic violence that occurred over the course of the relationship, which is really, understands better than a lot of states how intimate partner violence actually plays out. It's not one particular discrete physical incident. It's a relationship over time. But one thing that could be improved about California's law is an increase in that statute of limitations, because 3 years, a survivor really can't be expected to get everything together and initiate a suit until they have stable housing, until, they have a stable income. And all of that is going to take a little bit of time, more time for a lot of survivors than 3 years. And additionally, as I've kind of mentioned before, it's really difficult for a survivor to find an attorney to represent them in these kinds of cases because of the funding restrictions. So, part of what FreeFrom had been doing was when survivors would be referred to us, and we would essentially, survivors who wanted to initiate a civil action against their harm doer, and we would try to refer them to one of our partner attorneys. And I'm telling y'all, it takes so long to find anybody who is willing to take it on, can take it on. One particular survivor, over a year, unable to find anybody to take her case. So that would be helpful is to really extend that statute of limitations.
So, Ms. Durrence, I don't want to, I apologize for cutting you short, but we're running short.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I want to close with this. I'm so sorry. I just want to close with this. Thank you so much again. And, I think that there is something that's actually really exciting and hopeful about reframing how we look at domestic violence and framing it in this way. And that is when we really focus on this critical nexus between intimate partner violence and financial insecurity, we look at the number one reason that survivors stay in or return to abuse is because they can't afford to leave or stay safe. We're taking a problem that seems too big and unsolvable, and we're making it more solvable. If we can get every single survivor to a place of financial security where they don't have to stay when they don't want to, then we're helping them break their own personal cycle of violence. We're helping them get their kids out of that, and we're helping in that piece to break the intergenerational cycle of violence. So anyway, I think it's really exciting, and there's some hope there. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, we have one public comment, which is from Lakin Ambries, who's with Haven Women's Center. If you can come up to the table, and we do limit public comment to 3 minutes, so please try to be brief.
Welcome.
So, thank you. Yes, my name is Lakin Ambries. I am with Haven Women's Center in Stanislaus County. I oversee our housing program. We implement a Housing First program, and I just kind of wanted to share a little bit about, yes, how great the Housing First program is, the flexibility, but in practice, there are still some gaps that maybe can't be filled with Housing First funding, but I still wanted the Commission to be aware of it. One of the biggest gaps that we see in helping survivors are those that are undocumented. Maybe it's a mixed status family. We have a substantial amount of issues when it comes to trying to work with landlords because they don't see a Social Security number on the application, so they flat out refuse. For a lot of these survivors, we try and use double deposits, try and incentivize landlords in other ways, but it's proven to be very, very difficult for these mixed status families. Another one of our biggest issues are those that are on fixed income, and it could be seniors or it could be those that are on disability. And for the same reasons, landlords see the lack of income, even if the survivors themselves feel they can cover the rent, they have some sufficient Social Security income to pay for their basic needs. Landlords say, if you don't have 3 times the amount, it's only a matter of time. And so for those individuals as well, it has proven to be extremely difficult to get into housing. And then last, the clients and the survivors that we serve that are eligible for other housing assistance, either through other housing programs, a lot of those housing programs that are federal programs follow the HUD definition of homelessness, which means you are chronically homeless, in emergency shelter, or someplace not fit for human habitation. Many of the clients that we serve have children and do not either go to their car or go to shelters because they try and maintain some stability for their family. And so their homelessness looks a lot different. It's couch surfing, staying in a room where their whole family is in a room, or they're using all of their income to pay for hotels. And unfortunately, under HUD's definition, they do not meet that definition of homelessness. The flexibility of the Housing First funds does allow us to help these survivors and work with them through our program to help them ultimately take over the rents, ultimately become self-sufficient. A lot of what the previous speaker said is right. A lot of survivors, they don't leave because they can't afford to leave. And so I really just wanted to highlight those 3 points and just have those as in consideration.
Great. Thank you very much for your testimony. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for being here today on this very important topic. And we heard great testimony. Chairman Nava usually gives these very eloquent speeches at the end of these, and I'm not so good at it. But I do really want to sincerely show gratitude for all of your input on this. And we heard a lot of interesting things from our perspective that we can take back and provide recommendations to the governor's administration and the legislature, and hopefully make an impact on this important topic and help improve the lives of those that are affected by this really unfortunate intimate partner violence. So we will do our work, and we appreciate all of your work on this as well. So with that, we're adjourned.